Hey everyone, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy the audiobooks, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a Patreon member. As a member, you'll gain the ability to request the next part of a novel audiobook I've uploaded, depending on your Patreon tier.
Elijah stalked the Voxian monster as it, in turn, attempted to do the same to him. Of course, because he was cloaked in guise of the unseen, it had no clue where he was, which was precisely how Elijah liked it. As a mist panther, he was only marginally more durable than he was as a human, so caution was a necessity, rather than a choice. Fortunately, his abilities made it easier. Taking one careful step at a time, he silently closed with the monster. It was a bit bigger than the 10 creatures he'd killed during the previous wave, but it was comparatively slower as well. That meant that it was a perfect target for Elijah's brand of hunting, which involved rapid attacks and hit-and-run tactics that kept him out of harm's way. However, this time, he had something different in mind. Activating an ability was different than using a spell. Instead of dragging Ethera from his core, he harnessed the ubiquitous energy from his surroundings, funneling it through his mind and into his soul. From there, he let it seep into his body before darting forward and activating the ability. There were no mental commands. Instead, he simply acted according to the instincts that came with the ability. Thus, he used Predator Strike for the first time. His claws flashed toward the monster's spine, not an optimal target for his usual tactics, but Elijah trusted his instincts to guide him appropriately. He moved with unnatural speed, and just before his claws connected, he felt a surge of power burst forth. An instant later, he tore through the monster's back, slicing through its thick scales with ease. His claws crushed the creature's backbone, then severed its spine before raking across its organs. Elijah was so surprised by the sheer power of the attack that he almost forgot that the thing was still alive. Only at the last second did he remember to leap away. Fortunately, the lumbering creature, which was more than 6 feet tall and built like the world's most ill-proportioned bodybuilder, was slowed by the sudden obliteration of its spine. So even with Elijah's hesitation, its counterattack only found air. But Elijah didn't melt back into the shadows like he normally would have. Instead, he slowly circled the Voxian monster as it dropped to one knee. Then, unable to support itself, it fell forward. Elijah watched as the thing struggled against its new infirmity, dragging its increasingly useless legs as it dug its claws into the loam-covered forest floor. It growled. It spat. It even barked something that might have been an attempt at communication. But Elijah simply continued to watch, waiting as contagion, which was a passive ability that came with his transformation into a mist panther, took hold. Gradually, the disease spread, further weakening the monster until it coughed up black blood. With a last surge of strength, it tried to heave itself toward Elijah, but it came a half-dozen feet short before, finally, it succumbed. Elijah continued to circle, keeping his eyes and ears peeled just in case there were more monsters about. He felt nothing, but that wasn't an indicator that there were no more interdimensional invaders. In the past, he'd found a few spontaneous manifestations that specialized in stealth. If any of those had come with the second surge, he'd be far more pressed. But Elijah found nothing. The second surge had come a few hours after he'd killed the last of the previous wave of monstrous invaders, and according to Nerthus, that pattern would continue until he entered the tower. If he conquered it, then a period of peace would follow. If not, then the tower would disgorge a fresh wave the moment he failed. And again every few hours after that, eventually taking over the entire area. They would eventually break down on their own, something about their natures being incompatible with Earth, but not before doing untold damage to the environment. If it happened enough throughout the world, then Earth would begin to change, eventually becoming inhospitable to the natives. Of course, that would take hundreds of years, but according to Nerthus, it had happened often enough in other worlds that it was a very real danger for Earth's future. So, Elijah wasn't just tasked with fighting for his own island. Instead, he was fighting for the whole world, which was why he didn't let himself hesitate before transforming back into a human and gathering his woven satchel. It contained enough berries and mushrooms to last him about a week, which he hoped would be enough to conquer the tower. Nerthus had been silent on whether or not that was the case, which didn't fill Elijah with much confidence. Once he'd slung the satchel across his back, he set off at a jog across the island. He was still under the effects of Essence of the Wolf, but he'd also cast his other augmentations as well, including Essence of the Boar, because upon reaching level 20, he'd gained another enhancement slot. Hopefully, he wouldn't need the extra constitution that came with Essence of the Boar, but he suspected that was an impotent fantasy. Nerthus had spoken of the tower like it would be a challenge, and Elijah had learned to trust the little tree spirit's judgment. So, he was ready to be pushed to his limits. Soon enough, Elijah reached the cliff that was his destination, and in the distance, he saw the pillar of stone protruding from the waves like a giant, rocky finger. It was a foreboding sight, and not just because Elijah fully expected that entering the tower was extremely dangerous. That was part of it, but there was also a sense of unease that came with the mere sight of it. Was that natural? Or was it part of its magic? Elijah didn't know, and he suspected that he wouldn't soon find out. So, without further hesitation, he took a deep breath, then commenced with what would have once been an arduous climb. However, with the benefit of his increased attributes, the descent had become trivial, and soon enough, he found himself leaping into the water. At first, Elijah tried to hold his satchel and staff above the waves, but it soon became clear that he was fighting a losing battle. So, even though he knew it would ruin most of the food inside, he stopped trying to keep the contents of the satchel dry. With the staff, at least, he was confident that it could endure the salt water fairly well. Even if it hadn't been a magical piece of equipment, it was well sealed. Lowering his head, Elijah began to swim forward. His heart pounded as he imagined various sea creatures nibbling on his toes. Before Earth's transformation, he wouldn't have thought twice about swimming in the ocean. But now, with how much the wildlife had changed, it wasn't difficult to conjure a scenario where some overgrown fish decided that he looked like a viable meal. Still, he didn't have much choice but to keep going forward. His grove needed him, and if Nerthus was to be believed, so did the rest of the world. So, he pushed his fears to the back of his mind and continued with his swimming stroke. After a while, he finally reached the pillar. Up close, he could clearly see the straight lines and the hints of intelligent design that marked it as an artificial creation. Of course, that wasn't entirely true either. Not if one considered the towers to be natural. But Elijah didn't spend long pondering that distinction before he took a deep breath and dove into the water. Fortunately, with his level of body cultivation, his senses had been greatly improved. Without eyes of the eagle, he couldn't really see further, but obstructing forces like darkness and seawater were not the barriers to sight that they once might have been. So, when he dove beneath the waves, Elijah could see far more clearly than he'd expected. 5 smaller pillars surrounded the central column, though they didn't extend more than a foot or two above the surface. As he dove, Elijah saw that they were not, in fact, separate columns. Instead, the smaller pillars of stone connected to the larger, forming the head of a decorative staff. Elijah categorized it that way because he quickly recognized that it was held by a giant, stone hand that was, in turn, connected to an equally large arm that ended in a shoulder. Next came a torso that extended into the darkness hundreds of feet below. He couldn't even see the seafloor. But even so, Elijah kept going, using the shaft of the huge, stone staff as a guide. Fortunately, with his enhanced attributes, he could swim far more quickly than he ever could have before becoming a druid, and as such, he quickly reached the bottom. There, he saw a landscape of flora that rivaled the island that had become his home. Seaweed danced upon the seafloor, mingling with multi-hued coral while giant crabs scuttled about. Fish, some of which he recognized, but most were species he'd never seen before, darted here and there, adding to the underwater ecosystem. If Elijah had had a ready source of oxygen, he would have happily remained in place where he could simply observe the wondrous sight. However, the moment he dipped below the surface, the clock had begun to tick, and he only had a limited amount of time before even his enhanced body ran out of air. More, the tower still needed to be conquered, lest it spit more Voxian monsters into the world. So, without further hesitation, Elijah swam across the seafloor, carefully avoiding anything that looked particularly dangerous as he headed toward the base of what he now recognized was a giant, headless statue. When he reached his destination, Elijah was unsurprised to see what appeared to be a Greek-style temple, complete with a triangular pediment and carved columns. He was no expert on architecture, but Elijah recognized the style nonetheless, which begged the question of how something so alien would adopt such a familiar form. Unfortunately, he didn't have the time to seek out an answer, because his body had begun to protest the lack of oxygen. So, he swam forward, intending to continue his investigation until he was forced to resurface. But soon enough, Elijah found what he was looking for in the entrance to the temple. The portal, which extended from one column to the next, shimmered with unnatural light. Elijah kicked forward, but when he got close, he found himself hesitating. If he went in, there would be no going back. Either he conquered the tower, whatever that really meant, or he would die. There was no in between. There would be no early exits. Win or die. Those were the conditions Nerthus had described, and Elijah wasn't certain he wanted to commit to that. Not even to protect the grove. Maybe not even to safeguard the world against an invasion of Vox. The smart thing to do was to head back to the island, use the boat he'd taken from the invaders to cross the strait to the mainland, then leave everything behind. He could survive the wilderness well enough, and he could start towards his goal of finding what remained of his family. Surely they could use his help. For a long moment, he considered abandoning his responsibilities. Did that make him a coward? Maybe. Or perhaps it simply made him smart, because heading into unknown danger was not the intelligent thing to do, no matter how he spun it. Certainly, it might be necessary, but it definitely wasn't smart. After a few more seconds, during which his oxygen levels continued to dwindle, Elijah made a decision. If he couldn't risk his life to protect the world and all the people in it, he didn't deserve the second chance he'd been given. After all, he'd already made his peace with his own mortality. If he died now, he would do so trying to do the right thing. So, he swam forward and passed through the portal. A moment later, he fell into darkness. He tried to gasp, but he was still surrounded by water. However, unlike before, he could see nothing. Then, he remembered something his father had taught him a very long time ago. Look for the bubbles. The idea was simple. Bubbles would always rise to the surface. So, if he ever found himself underwater and unsure of which way to swim, he only needed to look for the bubbles. So, he pursed his lips and blew, resulting in a stream of bubbles that he then followed to the surface only 10 feet above him. When his head broke through, light pierced his eyes. For a second, he wondered why the light hadn't penetrated into the water, but that only lasted a moment before the need to breathe crashed into him. He took a series of deep, gulping breaths before finally taking stock of his surroundings. He was in a cave. That much was immediately obvious. Stalactites descended from the ceiling, and a few dozen feet away, Elijah could see a rocky edifice that he hoped was the shore. So, he swam forward until he finally clapped his arm on the curiously porous rock. Like that, he remained stationary as he caught his breath. After a few minutes, he climbed atop the boulder and pushed himself to his feet. When he did, he very nearly let out a gasp of surprise. In the distance, maybe a quarter-mile away across another expanse of water, he saw a village. That was odd enough, considering that he'd had to swim hundreds of feet below the surface to get to the portal. But what made it even stranger was that it was populated by what looked like humanoid walruses. The moment Elijah laid eyes on the creatures, a notification flashed before his eyes. Welcome to the College Tower, Level 1. To advance to Level 2, complete the task before you. Elijah shook his head, then looked at the next notification. Task: save the Ulthrak village from annihilation. Upon reading that message, he muttered, "This is a lot more involved than I expected." Before Elijah swam to shore, he took a moment to take on the shape of the predator. However, the moment he did, he got a bit of a surprise when he suddenly realized that mist panthers were apparently very poor swimmers. He could stay afloat and he could move a little, but his frantic flailing ruined any chance at maintaining guise of the unseen. So, he let the transformation drop and treaded water until he'd regained enough Ethera to comfortably approach the village. By the time he did, he'd garnered enough attention from the village's occupants. Indeed, stealth had never been an option. A few of the larger creatures stood on the rocky shore, gesturing threateningly with long spears. So, when Elijah got close enough to stand, he did so, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. He'd have preferred to find a different route on shore, but the lagoon was entirely enclosed. So, the stretch of beach before him, which was about 300 yards long, was the only way out of the water. "I come in peace," he said, hoping that there wasn't a language barrier. "I'm here to help." That much was true. After all, the task he'd received from the tower had made it very clear that he needed to save a village. It didn't take a genius or a leap of logic to assume that the village in question lay before him. That meant that the humanoid walruses were the Ulthrak he needed to save. Of course, that would almost assuredly require their cooperation, which was why he'd tried the peaceful approach. However, he had enough Ethera to fuel Shape of the Predator if they proved less than cooperative. "Where'd you come from?" demanded the largest spear wielder. Like all the others, he had 2 arms, 2 legs, and opposable thumbs, which set him apart from Earth walruses, yet he still possessed the characteristic whiskers, tusks, and general girth of the creatures with which Elijah had associated him. The fact that he spoke English would have been surprising if not for 2 things. 1, Elijah had heard the little, dagger-wielding gnomes speak English months before. And 2, he'd grown used to the existence of Ethera-powered magic, so he didn't think anything could surprise him. "At the surface," Elijah said. "I don't." "It's a tower, Raji," said one of the other Ulthraks. "That's what old Megala's been trying to tell you. That's why we can't get out. That's why." "He's right," Elijah said, earning a glare from Raji. "My world, I don't know if you know anything about Earth, but this tower just popped up out of the ocean. If I don't conquer it, these things called the Vox are going to overwhelm my home." Honesty seemed like the best policy, especially when he got a distinct impression of danger from the overlarge Raji. Elijah had never been a great liar, anyway, and he had a feeling if he tried to make something up, he'd end up telling such an unbelievable tale that he'd end up with a spear in his gut. Then, as Elijah was getting ready to defend himself, Raji's shoulders sagged, and he said, "I knew it." Didn't want to believe it, but, well, what else could it be? "If you knew it, then why'd you argue with Megala all this time?" said the smaller Ulthrak. "I think you—" Raji glared at the other humanoid walrus, which shut him up in a hurry. Elijah took that opportunity to ask, "What is going on here?" "I thought I was coming in here to fight corrupted reptiles from another dimension." It sounded silly when Elijah said it, but it was the best way to describe what he'd expected out of the tower. Raji answered, "You'd better come with us. Our survival likely depends on you." If Elijah hadn't already been tasked with saving the village, he might have refused. However, he reasoned that completing his task would be a lot easier if he had cooperation from the people he was intended to save, so he just asked, "Are you Ulthraks, by the way? Is that your species, I mean? We are, led on, I guess," Elijah stated, wading forward until he climbed onto shore. Once he did, Raji turned and led him into the village, which was a collection of huts that looked like they'd been built from whale bones and the hide of some sort of gray-skinned animal. And to Elijah's surprise, when he looked up, he saw stars winking back at him via a giant hole in the roof of the cavern. He followed Raji through the village until they reached a hut that was much larger than any of the others. Along the way, they passed more of the Ulthrak villagers, many of whom were clearly female, while the smaller ones were obviously children. None of them looked particularly happy, and in fact, Elijah saw more than a few poorly dressed wounds among the villagers. As he and Raji passed through the larger hut's door, he chanced a question asking, "What happened here? Was there some sort of battle?" "The water goblins," Raji said, crossing the single room and taking a seat on a large cushion. He gestured to another, saying, "Sit. I will explain everything." "Not without me here, you won't, you big idiot," came a scathing voice from the entrance. Elijah's head whipped around, and he saw an old, incredibly thin Ulthrak standing nearby. His skin hung off of him in great bunches, like an obese man who'd recently lost most of his body weight, and he carried a crooked staff with an elaborate head of feathers. "You'll send our guest out to fight the goblins when he'd clearly be better suited for other tasks. He doesn't even know what's going on, Megala. More reason to use him to solve the real problems, Just let me explain to him what's going on. Then we'll let him pick his path. You know that's how this has to work. Curse the gods for putting us in this situation." "The gods?" "No, curse our own weakness, Raji." "That too." "Well, get on with it," said Megala, crossing the hut. He used the staff like a walking stick, but to Elijah's senses, it glowed with power. Megala must have noticed because he said, "Like my staff, Thinking about taking it? You wouldn't be the first to try." Raji rolled his eyes, a strange sight, given he was a giant walrus man, and said, "Don't threaten him, Megala. We need his help to get out of this. You think there's any way out of this? No, we're doomed to a—" Raji said, "Enough. Let me explain. He's too skinny. And he has so little power. A child could." "Enough." Raji roared, and the smaller Ulthrak flinched back. "Enough. I just want to know what's going on," Elijah said. "Is this real?" "Yes. And no," Raji stated. "The reality is that no one really knows. I remember my life. I remember fighting against the goblins. But I know that if I'm in a tower, I'm not the real me." "Just spit it out, Raji," said Megala, who'd managed to regain some of his vigor. "We are projections," Raji said. "Probably. If this tower is conquered, then our people will get some sort of benefit. It's all fuzzy, like everything is obscured. I don't even think we're in our normal bodies." Megala sighed. "Our people volunteered for this," he said. "We were given an opportunity to be recorded by the system, which we took in exchange for some sort of power. I don't know what. Like the big idiot there said, it's all a little fuzzy. Once the system had our souls in its grasp. We're not souls, Megala. Sure, our essence, that our reflections. Whatever the case, once it had us, we were put to work populating towers like this," he said. "For you, this is all real. But for us? When you die, we'll just loop back around and start all this over again so the next group that comes in here will have a proper challenge. Until we satisfy the terms of our agreement. Then this little piece will be reunited with the host, and, well, the rest is all just conjecture based on blurry memories." It was a lot to take in. If Elijah understood it right, then according to Megala, none of the people he'd seen were real. Instead, they were lifelike projections of people who actually existed, or at least had existed at some point. How does that even work? Do you just show up to some system kiosk and tell them you want to get recorded? He asked. Megala gave a derisive chuckle. "That's actually not that far off," he said. "There are people who—" "We can't tell him any of that." "Why not?" "I'm not." At that very moment, Megala simply ceased to exist. 1 second, the skinny Ulthrak was there, and the next, nothing of him remained. "What the system sanction?" Raji said. "Everyone has to follow the rules. I don't know anything about wherever you came from, but I'm guessing the system is fairly new to you." "It is. The one thing you need to know is that system likes its rules," Raji said. "Either you follow them, or bad things happen. Out there, you might just have a run of bad luck. Or you could end up being targeted by heaven's wrath. Probably the latter if you manage to get the system's attention. But for us, it's much, much worse. We're not physical beings, so we're easy to stamp out." Elijah nodded. Nerthus had been prevented from answering his questions on more than one occasion, which supported Raji's explanation. Still, it seemed incredibly callous to end someone's existence over something so trivial. Sure, Megala hadn't been strictly real, but he'd clearly been capable of independent thought, which made him real enough that Elijah felt sorry for him. "What happens if you die?" Raji shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "Nothing good, I'm sure. At best, I'll just cease to exist while my host continues living his life. Or hers, I suppose. But at worst, they'll be punished in some way. I feel like I used to know, but it's all blurry." "You said that," Elijah said, nodding along. "I see from your expression that you understand," Raji said. "We know we're not real, but we feel pain. We think. We have goals. We have lives. We love. We hate. And we want to live. Will you help us? Branching task: save the Ulthrak village or destroy them. Choose wisely, because there are rewards at the end of both paths." There were probably plenty of people who would have chosen the second option. Certainly, it seemed easier. However, for Elijah, it was never really an option. There was no way he could just kill the Ulthraks he'd met. If they'd attacked him, it would have been a different story, but that wasn't how it had happened. "Can you tell me how this all works?" Elijah asked. "Like I said, I came in here expecting to fight interdimensional reptiles." Raji shook his head. "I can't tell you much," he said. "Not until you, Well, here's what I can tell you. These towers are just constructs meant to siphon Ethera from powerful interdimensional rifts. But left alone, a siphon isn't enough. It'll eventually overflow. The surges, Elijah said, remembering the waves of reptilian vox. That's just a side effect, but yeah, that's the gist of it. When someone like you comes in and challenges the tower, it has to spend that Ethera to run things, he explained, and to provide rewards. So, most towers need to be constantly drained of Ethera, or, well, things overflow. But that means I'll have to keep challenging it if I want to keep this from happening again? Elijah asked. In most cases, yes. There are ways around it, but, well, I can't speak to that. So, will you help us? Elijah nodded. I intend to, but I'm not sure what I can really do, he said. I'm not a great fighter. Is the rest of your team going to join you? Did you get separated? I don't have a team. You challenged a tower by yourself? Oh, that's not good. I'm beginning to realize that, Elijah said. But I'm here now, and I don't think there's a way out unless I finish it. So, tell me what needs to be done, and I'll do what I can to help. What are your abilities? Elijah didn't want to reveal all his cards, so he chose to keep his ability to take on the form of a mist panther a secret. He said, I can heal some, and I can. You can heal? How often? And how efficiently? The Ulthrak asked, his words tumbling out of his tusked mouth in a rapid stream. Never mind. We'll figure it out, Raji said, pushing his bulk upright. Come with me. With that, he strode from the building. Elijah sprang to his feet and hurried after him, catching up just in time to hear Raji tell the smaller Ulthrak from before to gather all the sick and wounded in the town square. The smaller walrus man rushed off, presumably to do as he was asked, and Elijah followed Raji into the center of the town, which was characterized by a tall tree with gleaming white leaves. So, what do you need? We don't have much coin, but I don't need anything, Elijah said. Just get everyone clumped around me, I guess. Raji nodded, and over the next half hour, the square slowly filled with injured Ulthrak. Some were carried in on leather stretchers, while others hobbled close on their own power. Soon enough, they were clustered so close to Elijah that he began to feel a little claustrophobic. But he pushed that discomfort aside, knowing full well that healing rain had a very limited area of effect. So, he needed to get as many people under the clouds as possible, his comfort be damned. Once everyone had been gathered, there were hundreds of Ulthrak in the square. Is this everyone? Elijah shouted over the din. Raji nodded from afar. Then, Elijah embraced the Ethera in his core, channeling it through his soul and into healing rain. When he cast the spell, a localized cloud materialized approximately 20 feet above him before dropping a steady drizzle on the area. It was only a couple dozen feet across, but it covered almost a third of the square. Immediately, the injured and sick Ulthrak began to notice the effects of the healing rain. Someone gleefully shouted that their wound had been healed, while others gasped in surprised relief. Elijah just stood there, preparing to refresh the spell when necessary. He tested it many times, so he knew it would last quite some time before the spell faded. In the meantime, he looked around, searching for someone who needed healing more urgently. And after only a moment, he sighted in on an Ulthrak woman who was covered in so many bandages that she looked like a slightly corpulent mummy. Elijah motioned for her to come closer, and she hobbled forward. What's your worst injury? Gut wound, she muttered, grimacing with each word. Here, Elijah said, kneeling down and pressing his hand against her abdomen. He could practically feel the injury. While he knew it wasn't the most efficient use of his Ethera, Elijah used Touch of Nature, sending a powerful pulse of healing cycling through his staff, then through his hand and into her body. He tried to guide it to the wound in her stomach, but without actually inspecting the injury, it was safer to simply bathe the area in healing energy and hope for the best. Still, the combination of the two spells, Healing Rain and Touch of Nature, did wonders, and in seconds her eyes widened in shock. I know, Elijah said, and for the first time since gaining his archetype, he understood his place in the world. He could fight, he could kill, but his true calling was preservation. Sometimes, that would take the form of coaxing natural growth from the landscape, as he had in his grove. Other times, he would be forced to defend the natural world, as he tried to do with the panther. But as he healed the Ulthrak woman's injuries, Elijah came to realize that he preferred the third option, mending the broken. They weren't real, not as he recognized reality, at least. Elijah knew that without a shadow of a doubt. However, that didn't seem to matter when he was surrounded by suffering people. Even if those people happened to be humanoid walruses. He had been at it for hours, and he was soaked with sweat that had mingled with precipitation from healing rain. He gasped, pulling his hand away from his latest patient. He was tiny, barely more than toddler-sized, and with tiny nubs for tusks. He'd also been on the edge of death before Elijah had stepped in and cured some sort of infection by virtue of healing touch. It had taken the last of his Ethera, but he'd finally done it. Everyone in the village who'd needed healing had gotten it. And Elijah had been rewarded accordingly. He glanced at the notifications he'd so far ignored, and he couldn't help but give a tired smile as he slumped to the ground and leaned against the tree in the center of the square. It felt different from the vegetation on his island. Like the shadow of a tree. Or a projection, which was probably more accurate. He leaned his head back and stared at the arboreal canopy, watching the stark white leaves dancing in the subtle breeze. Projection or not, it was definitely beautiful. He stared at it for a long few seconds before reading the notifications. Congratulations! You have reached level 21. Attribute points allocated according to your class. Then he moved on to the next one. Congratulations! You have reached level 22. Attribute points allocated according to your class. 2 levels in a single day. It was the fastest pace he'd managed since washing ashore, and he hadn't even gotten into a fight. That alone made him question his previous actions. If healing was so profitable, then what use did he have for killing? Of course, he'd yet to kill anything simply to gain kill energy. The crabs and other animals he'd hunted, he'd done so for food. The invaders he'd killed in order to protect the sanctity of his grove as well as in a doomed attempt to assist the panther. And the Vox? Well, that was less about killing and more about simple extermination. He likened it to pest control. Unpleasant, necessary, and ultimately beneficial. Whatever the case, it wasn't as if he'd set out to murder hordes of creatures for the sake of quick leveling. Elijah shook his head. He couldn't even fool himself. While he didn't think of himself as a bloodthirsty murderer, the reality was that he had enjoyed exterminating the Vox. He had gotten satisfaction from hunting and killing the various animals that were his main sources of food. And the invaders? They were the enemy. He'd known it from the first moment he'd laid eyes on that settlement across the strait, and that impression had been further cemented when they tried to kill the panther. No, he felt more guilty about killing crabs than he'd ever feel about taking out the invaders. That realization probably should have worried him, yet he was curiously ambivalent about it. He let out a sigh and focused on his status. Elijah Hart, level 22. Archetype, Druid, class, animist. Specialization, not applicable. Alignment, not applicable. Strength, 23. Dexterity, 22. Constitution, 23. 31. Regeneration, 25. Movement, nature, cultivation, body, formed, neophyte. His attributes truly were beginning to round out, and though his physical abilities hadn't really kept pace with his expectations, he was satisfied. Originally, he'd thought that the threshold for peak humanity was the 10-point mark. However, he'd had to reassess that assumption when he'd nearly doubled that point total, and he was still incapable of superhuman feats of physical prowess. Certainly, he felt confident that he'd reached at least Olympic athlete levels of ability, but he wouldn't be lifting any cars anytime soon. Before his latest burst of levels, he'd done a little testing, and as far as he could tell, it would take nearly triple his current totals to reach what he considered truly superhuman territory. For example, when he got to 60 strength, assuming he didn't advance his body cultivation, which seemed likely considering that he still hadn't figured out how to do so, he estimated that he'd be capable of comfortably lifting around 2,000 pounds. Of course, that was assuming the gains would be linear. From 1 to 10, they hadn't been, but ever since, each point seemed to account for around 20 extra pounds of lifting capacity. Then again, those were only estimates. It wasn't like he had a set of scales lying around, and little rocked and bigger rocked were not accurate units of measurement. Perhaps when he reached civilization, he could remedy that lack of accuracy. The scientist in him wanted nothing more than to sit down and develop a way to accurately test his current capabilities while putting together a predictive model for what he might expect going forward. But that would require his survival, which was anything but assured, given Raji's reaction to the fact that he'd entered the tower alone. Knowing that he would need all the tools he could acquire, Elijah consulted his spellbook and inspected his new spell. Conjure a swarm of pests that infect your enemies with appropriate afflictions. Nice, Elijah said, looking at the description. If it worked anything like contagion, which was a passive ability that gave his claws the ability to infect his victims with a disease that sapped their strength and slowly damaged them, the new ability would be a nice addition to his toolkit. Looking around, he wished he had an opportunity to test it, though he quickly thought better of that desire. If he was forced into battle mode, it would probably mean that the Ulthrax he'd just spent hours healing would once again be injured. "You've gotten stronger," came a soft voice from nearby. The child that had been his last patient had already scampered away, which meant that he'd thought he was alone. Clearly that wasn't the case, and he lowered his face and looked at the speaker. I recognize you, don't I?" he said, looking at the female Ulthrak. She was quite a bit smaller than males like Raji, but she was still quite bulky. Still, there was something undeniably feminine about her posture as well as her speaking voice. "I was the first person you healed," she said. "I came to thank you." With that, she held out a basket filled with some sort of fruit. Elijah took the container, saying, "Thank you." "No, thank you," she said. I don't think any of us would have survived without your efforts." Elijah shrugged. Anybody would have done the same. Indeed, his experience was that most people tended to work together when faced with catastrophe. He'd seen as much after wildfires, volcanic eruptions, and hurricanes. When disaster struck, people tended to step up. "I disagree. I don't remember much about who I am, I suppose. But every instinct tells me that many people put in your situation would have simply killed us, taken our hides, and..." Elijah gasped in horror. "Your hides? I shouldn't have said that." She backed away, suddenly afraid. Elijah held up his hands and said, I would never, why would anyone do that? "Ulthrak hides are extremely valuable," she said. "It is why the goblins hunt us. With Ulthrak hide armor, they will be able to hunt, grow stronger, and expand their territory." "Did you truly not know?" Elijah shook his head. The mere notion of killing and skinning sapient beings was absolutely abhorrent. Even if the walrus being's hides would make the best armor in the world, there was absolutely no way Elijah could ever use it. And he questioned the morality of anyone who could. Of course, that wasn't really fair. If the choice was between that and death, many would choose the path that would lead them to survival. But Elijah would rather die than take one step down that road. He had no issues with killing for food, or to protect himself or his territory. That was just natural. But hunting and murdering sapient beings just because they had some resource you wanted? A shiver went up his spine. "Oh, I definitely didn't know," Elijah said. He knew he couldn't say anything to put her at ease, so he simply shook his head and remained silent. He would have to let his actions speak for him. In that moment of silence, he latched onto something she'd said, so he asked, "How did you know I leveled? And what's your name?" "Taka," she said. "My name is Taka. And I knew because I have an ability that lets me inspect things. The system provides a description." "And what does it say about me?" "That you are a level 22 druid," was her answer. "I'm not powerful enough to gain any more information about you. But that staff, what about it?" "It glows with Ethera," Taka said. "Where did you get it?" "I made it." "Truly," she said, her eyes widening. It was almost like watching a cartoon. Her face was so expressive. "You are a great craftsman?" Elijah shook his head and let out a slight chuckle. "I'm really not. I just needed a good walking stick. I guess I overshot that mark by a little." Indeed, the fact that the staff could enhance his spells had been an incredible boon that had saved his life more than once. Shaking his head, Elijah stood up. The skittish Taka flinched back, but he ignored the movement. She had every right to be afraid, given that she didn't really know him. He'd healed her, certainly, but who was to say that he wouldn't turn on her now that he knew the value of her hide? He never would, but caution was absolutely the right decision on her part. Now that everyone's healed, I think it's time to see what comes next. What do you mean? The tower. I have to conquer it. I've chosen to save you all, but I still don't know what that really means. I hope Raji can point me in the right direction. With that, he strode off, quickly passing through the small village to reach the largest hut in the village. The flap that served as the building's door hung open, so Elijah pushed through it. When he did, he saw that Raji was sitting in the center and eating something from a bowl. He quickly pushed his bulk upright and said, "What can I do for you? Is everyone healed? I can't thank you enough for. I need to know what the win condition for this place is." "What?" "The win condition. I need to save your village. That's my goal." "So, how do I do that?" "I hope the healing would satisfy the requirements, but that's obviously not it. So, spit it out. How do I ensure your survival?" "The goblins," muttered Taka. "Oh, it's too dangerous." Raji interjected. "We need him to remain here where he can heal us." "That will. The goblins will keep coming. You know that, Raji. And we've already lost so many that we can't stand up to them. Every time they raid the village, we lose more people. Even if we can heal everyone who's injured, you know we can't save everyone," Taki said. "I can't in good conscience." "Where are these goblins?" Elijah asked. "You can't. You know I'm not going to stay here indefinitely. I'm leaving one way or another," Elijah stated. "I just need you to point me in the right direction, and I'll be out of your whiskers." Raji shook his head. Elijah knew why the Ulthrak wanted him to stay. He'd already made it clear what he thought of Elijah trying to conquer the tower solo, but he'd also seen the good that could be done via Elijah's healing spells. Likely, he considered it the only way Elijah could lend any aid. Of course, Elijah didn't think like that. Instead, he wanted to at least investigate the situation before he wrote it off as a lost cause. After all, he had abilities of which the Ulthraks were ignorant, and he felt confident that he could at least hold his own. Otherwise, Nerthus never would have sent him into the tower. But he couldn't say that, not without revealing his secrets and losing any advantage he might have in the event of betrayal. He didn't want to think the Ulthraks would turn on him. He was an optimist, after all, but trust was earned, not freely given. And the humanoid walruses simply hadn't displayed anything but a willingness to take healing where it was offered. "Fine," Raji said. "If you head to the other side of the village, you'll see a path that leads up to the surface. Once there, look to the west. That's where the goblins live." Elijah nodded, then said, "Thanks." Before he left, he looked down at his satchel. The mushrooms and berries he'd brought with him had been ruined by immersion in the salt water, so he asked, "Do you have any rations? I think I might be up there for a while." Raji nodded, and Taka pushed the basket of fruit back into his hands. He hadn't even realized he'd left it behind. Nor did he remember seeing Taka retrieve it. Still, he took the fruit with a grateful nod as Raji left the hut. He returned a few moments later and handed a parcel to Elijah, saying, "Dried fish. It's not much, but it should last you a few days if you pace yourself." "Thank you. Is there anything I can say to keep you from going?" Raji asked. "Our village isn't much, but you could stay here for a while longer. You would be safe even if you couldn't leave." Elijah answered, "This is something I have to do. But look on the bright side. If I'm successful, I'll conquer the tower." Raji shrugged his massive shoulders, saying, "Doesn't matter. We'll just cycle. I'll forget this ever happened. At best, I'll finish whatever my commitment is and rejoin the real me. I don't know. Either way, win or lose, it's all the same. So long as we don't die." "What happens then?" "Nothing good," Raji said, and by the set of his tusks, Elijah knew he would get nothing else out of the big Ulthrak. So, he once again thanked his hosts, then turned and left. As he did, he heard Raji remark, "No way he makes it?" Taka said, "I think he will." "Then you're just as much an idiot as him," Raji responded. He said something else, but by that point, Elijah had gone out of hearing range. He trekked through the village, then when he reached the edge, found the path leading into a tunnel that, in turn, rose at a gradual incline. Elijah followed it, and over the next 20 minutes, the path twisted and turned, steadily climbing until it finally led him to the surface. There, Elijah stopped to marvel at the sight before him. To his left stretched a vast tundra of rolling white hills, and to his right was an expansive ocean. Glaciers and other blocks of ice floated nearby, completing the biome's appearance. "This is all in a tower," he muttered to himself, glancing at the sky. Night still reigned, but on the distant horizon was the vague illumination that preceded a sunrise. As the cold seeped into his bones, Elijah was suddenly aware of just how underdressed he was. In the fairly temperate summer of the Pacific Northwest, his ragged pants and barely their shirt offered plenty of protection. But in sub-zero temperatures? Even with his increased resistance to the elements that came with his enhanced constitution, he knew he wouldn't last more than a few days before frostbite set in. Sighing, he realized that he had no choice but to embrace shape of the predator, if only because, as a panther, he had thick fur that would protect him from the cold. So, he turned his attention to his rations, then dug into the fruit. He ate as much as he could stomach, then placed the dried fish in his satchel. He wrapped the bag as tightly as he could before finally embracing his spell and transforming into a mist panther. Immediately, the cold felt less pervasive, placing his decision firmly in the good idea column. Then, he dipped his head, grabbed the folded satchel containing his remaining rations between his jaws, and set off to the west. Hopefully, he would quickly find the so-called water goblins so he could at least scout things out. After that, he'd make a plan for how he was going to defeat them. The sun shone bright in the clear, blue sky as Elijah padded across the tundra. His steps were so light that he barely even left prints across the snow, but even as cautious as he was, he still moved quickly enough that, within a couple of hours of sunrise, he spotted the first sign of civilization when he saw a dark plume of smoke twisting in the air. Soon after, a series of buildings came into view. Reminiscent of the architecture of the Ulthrak village, the building's walls were composed of thick, gray hides stretched across a bone frame. However, the basic construction was where the resemblance ended. Instead of being low-slung dwellings, the ones arrayed around a shallow bay were octangular structures that stood on tall pylons. Between the buildings stretched a series of rope bridges, across which scurried a population's small, blue figures. Elijah stopped a few hundred yards away and, after letting shape of the predator lapse, returned to his human form. He crouched low, planting himself behind a snowdrift. Thus concealed, he waited on his Ethera to regenerate. As he did, he once again lamented his lack of appropriate clothing. With his constitution, he could withstand the biting cold, but it wasn't pleasant. So, the few minutes he spent waiting left him shivering uncomfortably. Still, he refused to accelerate his schedule, which hinged on him having a full core before he took even the most basic actions. So, he waited patiently, slowly pulling Ethera through the funnel of his mind. Without any outside stimuli to distract him, he could bolster his regeneration via meditation. The effect wasn't so dramatic as to double the speed with which he could refill his core, but it was still significant enough to show a noticeable benefit. Gradually, his core refilled, and when it reached saturation, he poked his head over the snow drift and used Eyes of the Eagle to get a better look at the creatures he expected would be his opponents. They were water goblins, he was certain. Blue-skinned, with long arms and squat legs, they moved like primates. However, with Eyes of the Eagle, Elijah could see gills running just below their sharp jaws. In addition, they were equipped with bat-like ears, short, stubby noses, and sharp teeth. In short, aside from the gills, posture, and blue skin, they looked remarkably similar to the goblin intruder who'd helped kill the panther back on his island. And yet, there was something different about them, too. They were more animalistic. More than once, Elijah saw one member of the community growl and attack another. It was like they were primal versions of the comparatively more civilized goblin he'd previously encountered. Or perhaps he was simply seeing what he expected to see. After all, he knew what these water goblins had done to the Ulthrak village. And he knew why. The idea of anyone raiding a community of sentient creatures just to harvest their hides was absolutely abhorrent. Further disgusting Elijah was the giant whale carcass lying on the icy beach on the other side of the bay. Water goblins scurried all over it, hacking away with primitive tools they used to harvest meat, blubber, and skin. It didn't take him long to connect the gray hide that comprised the walls of the village's buildings with the similarly hued skin of the whale. Of course, whaling wasn't terrible in and of itself. People needed to eat, and in a primitive culture like the goblins, whaling may very well have been the only real source of food. However, judging by the gleeful shouts coming from the harvesting goblins, there was more to it than that. Besides, he was well aware of his own personal bias which emanated from predatory whaling practices back on Earth. Elijah watched and waited, spending quite some time studying the village. The goblins might have been primitive, but they were clearly sapient and organized, as evidenced by the community they had created. However, the longer Elijah watched them, the more he felt secure in his decision to side with the Ulthrak. But for the life of him, he couldn't quite pinpoint why he felt that way. On the surface, they just looked like a normal, if primitive, people. Sure, he was probably biased against them due to what they'd done to the Ulthrak, but there was far more to it than that. He felt it in his bones that they were the enemy. And then he realized what it was. The blue-skin goblins were all wearing leather armor. Armor that was obviously made of Ulthrak hides. The moment Elijah realized the origin of his disdain, the feeling intensified. No one had ever told him what it meant to be a druid, but his archetype wasn't simply a line on his status and a few useful spells. It meant more than that. Back in the Ulthrak village, he discovered that healing was part of it, but he was also a defender, wasn't he? Looking at the goblins, he was reminded of how he felt about the settlement across the strait from his island. They weren't interested in living with the land, nor were they concerned with conservation. Instead, they only took harvesting whatever they needed and leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. It wasn't environmentalism that he cared about. Not really, or not as he would have thought of it before the Earth's inclusion in the wider universe. Rather, it was about balance. And finding a way to live with the world in a mutually beneficial way rather than simply consuming whatever you needed to let you gain power. As he sat there watching the village, Elijah considered his feelings. But by the time night fell, he'd gotten no closer to true understanding. However, what he had realized was that he needed to kill the goblins. Part of it was due to the task set by the system, but it was also because he needed to stay true to his druidic calling. So, when night fell, he used Shape of the Predator and, leaving his pack of supplies behind the snowbank, set off toward the goblin village. As he did so, he cloaked himself with Guise of the Unseen. Silent and all but invisible, he approached the village. Many of the goblins had already retired for the night, but there were a few still up and about. Guards, perhaps? Regardless, Elijah's vendetta was indiscriminate. With surety of purpose, he stalked his first victim, passing under the houses as he crept from shadow to shadow. Soon enough, the blue goblin had separated itself, and he pounced, using Predator Strike. It was over before the goblin ever knew what had happened. It fell, disemboweled by Elijah's first attack, and with its throat slit by the second. Its aquamarine blood pooled on the snow as Elijah dragged it into the shadows beneath one of the buildings. After that, Elijah continued his task, and the goblins fell, one after another. None of them even knew he was there, much less tried to defend themselves. Thus, the power of his class truly became evident. As he swept through the village, silently slaughtering water goblins, he was too focused to consider the morality of his actions. However, after he'd killed the final creature, he stumbled across the building where they butchered and skinned the Ulthrak they'd taken prisoner. After that, any sympathy he might have felt dissipated before the harsh reality of their actions. Only after he had seen that grisly charnel house did Elijah get a notification from the system. Congratulations! You have completed level 1 of College Tower. Great. To progress further, find the portal to level 2. Then, a small box appeared before him. It was a simple, metal cube about 4 inches wide, but it radiated enough Ethera to surprise Elijah. He leaned forward, sniffing it, but even with his panther's senses, he smelled nothing out of the ordinary. So, he let Shape of the Predator drop before reaching down and flipping the box's latch. It sprang open, revealing a simple pewter ring. Elijah took it, resulting in a new notification. Reward for completing level 1 of College Tower. Ring of Aquatic Travel. The ring itself was carved with fanciful whorls, but otherwise, it looked entirely ordinary. Elijah slipped it on but felt nothing. The last time Elijah had acquired a magical item, he'd gotten a description. But perhaps that was because he'd created the Staff of Natural Harmony himself. Either way, aside from making an inference based on the ring's name, Elijah had no idea what the ring really did. He would do some testing once he made it out of the tower. In the meantime, he needed to find the portal to the next level. To that end, he searched through the village once again. However, he found nothing, so he expanded his parameters to the small bay abutting the settlement. The moment his feet touched the water, he felt a thrum of Ethera emanating from the center of the bay. It didn't take a leap of logic to recognize what it meant. The portal to the second level was down there. Groaning, he said, "Swimming again?" As much as he didn't want to do it, Elijah knew he didn't have much of a choice. So, after heading back to the snowbank where he'd spent most of the day observing the water goblin village, he retrieved his supplies and ate his fill. Fortunately, the water of the bay was fresh, so he'd already sated his thirst. Sure. But he wasn't going to question something that worked in his favor. The last thing he wanted to do was melt snow just so he could get a drink. With that done, Elijah checked to make sure that his Ethera had completely regenerated, then set off back to the bay. When he reached it, he waded in, and once the frigid water reached his midsection, he dove in. It was not pleasant. In fact, his entire body went numb after only a few seconds. With the knowledge that he didn't have much of a choice at the forefront of his mind, he forged ahead. Using the pulse of Ethera as his guide, he continued to swim until, a few dozen yards later, he was directly above it. Not wasting any time hesitating, Elijah dove. It only took a few seconds to recognize the portal. This time, it presented itself as a stone doorway, its corners twisted in such a way that he struggled to make sense of it. But he didn't care about that. With the cold sapping his energy, Elijah didn't have the luxury of time on his side. So, he swam down and passed through the door. Then, he was once again plunged into impenetrable darkness. However, this time, it didn't fade. Instead, a brief stab of light pierced Elijah's eyes, and suddenly he felt an incredibly strong undertow pulling him down. He fought against it, using every point of his enhanced strength attribute as he swam against the current, but it was useless. He couldn't escape. He couldn't even fight to a standstill. Instead, the inexorable current continued to pull him into the watery abyss. Panic suffused Elijah's mind as his oxygen ran out. But to his surprise, it didn't matter. That was when he remembered the name of his reward for completing the tower's first level. The Ring of Aquatic Travel clearly gave him the ability to survive underwater. Still, as Elijah was slowly pulled ever downward, his panic did not subside. Even if he wasn't going to drown, he had no idea what to expect next. Some indeterminate time later, Elijah hit something solid. But it wasn't the silt he would have expected. Instead, it was stone. Gradually, his eyes began to adjust, and what he saw shocked him to his core. Arrayed before Elijah was a maze of coral and seaweed. Even as he floated only a few feet above the seafloor, he forgot the conflict of the previous day. Instead, he focused entirely on the setting in front of him. Elijah had been diving many times in the past. He had his scuba license, and he'd been an avid free diver before being stricken with cancer. More, he'd watched countless videos of the depths and studied even more photos and texts while earning his doctorate. However, he'd never seen anything like the landscape laid out before him. Coral twisted hundreds of feet in the air, and the thick stalks of seaweed, barely waving in the current, looked like nothing so much as blades of grass. Huge schools of colorful fish flitted about, while Elijah caught sight of larger predators lurking within the forest of coral and seaweed. A shadow enveloped him, and he looked up. A sea serpent the size of a bus slithered hundreds of feet above him, cutting through the water with speed that would have rivaled an airplane. Elijah stared as it darted into the seaweed forest and passed out of view. That was when he noticed a notification waiting for him. Welcome to the College Tower, Level 2. To advance to Level 3, complete the task before you. It was almost identical to the notification that had greeted him upon his entry into the tower, and it was followed by a description of the task in question. Task: reach the center of the Sea of Sorrows and defeat the hegemonic guardian. Neither of those names sounded good. The words sorrow and hegemony did not fill him with the warm and fuzzies. But he knew he didn't have much in the way of choices. He couldn't very well turn back. Nor did he really want to. There was definitely something addictive about meeting the challenges laid out before him. In any case, there was every chance that the previous level had ceased to exist the moment he'd left it behind. Perhaps the scenario had already reset. Looking back, his emotions felt a bit silly. If none of it was real, and it wasn't, at least according to the Ulthrax and his own deductive ability, then what did any of it matter? He shouldn't have cared if the walrus people lived or died. Nor should the goblins have infuriated him so thoroughly. And yet they had. He could only reason that there was more at play than he knew. But that wasn't exactly surprising, given that he knew almost nothing about what was going on. At times, Elijah felt like he was being led around by the nose, and he very much didn't like it. For now, though, he needed to push those sorts of thoughts to the back of his mind and focus on accomplishing the task at hand and progressing to the third and final level of the tower. To that end, he sank to the sea floor and took cover behind a sizable rock so he could think about how he intended to accomplish the goals that had been thrust upon him. And not for the first time, he realized just how out of his depth and unprepared he really was. Until that point, he'd leaned on his shape of the predator, which he'd found was incredibly powerful. It allowed him to remain undetected and, when the time was right, strike hard and fast before sinking back into the shadows. But underwater, adopting that form just wasn't an option. When he tried to swim in his panther form, he'd barely been capable of remaining afloat. In theory, it ought to have been easy enough to adapt. After all, he knew how other animals swam, so it should have been a simple matter of practice before he mastered the necessary technique. But in this case, the instincts that came with the form had worked against him, inciting a simmering panic that had scuttled any attempt at rational thought. It had been all he could do to awkwardly paddle a few feet, much less swim through a territory the size of the Sea of Sorrows. So, he was stuck in his human form. Fortunately, he was extremely comfortable as a swimmer, and with the ring of aquatic travel giving him the ability to breathe underwater, he felt confident that he could at least survive the environment. However, he knew it wouldn't be so simple as to swim in the right direction. Never was that more clear than when he saw motion out of the corner of his eye. At first, he panicked, but that only lasted a split second before he realized that the creature he'd seen was hundreds of yards away. It was an eel, but one with coloring he'd never seen. It was also the size of a horse, which made it the largest eel he'd ever even heard about. It swam from the forest of seaweed and coral, chased by a school of much smaller fish that resembled barracuda. The smaller fish nipped at the eel's tail, but it quickly started to outpace them, until a huge claw descended from above, snapping the eel in half. Elijah tensed as the claw's owner splashed into the water from surface, revealing its entire form. It was a giant crab, because of course it was. But if every crab he'd ever killed had all somehow combined into one, they wouldn't have reached half the size of this newcomer's claw, much less the rest of its body. If it was any smaller than an aircraft carrier, Elijah would have been shocked. No, he was already shocked, regardless of his vehicle-based size estimations. The school of barracuda darted away, but the crab wasn't going to let even so small of a meal escape. It lashed out with his claw, and though it didn't make physical contact, the motion created an unnatural whirlpool that sucked the comparatively small fish into its gaping maw. The two halves of the still writhing eel soon followed, and before long, nothing was left of the brief hunt. Then, the crab floated up, eventually breaking through the surface. Where it went after that, Elijah couldn't see, and if he was honest, he had no interest in finding out. Over the next hour, he settled in to watch the sea. And as he did, patterns became clear. For one, anything that ventured above the forest of kelp and corral was quickly killed and eaten by the crab, so trying to swim above the fray was impossible. Elijah had no idea if it was the same crab or if it was a series of the creatures, but it didn't really matter for his purposes. Next, he saw that the ecosystem in the forest was, to put it mildly, one based on predation. If there were herbivorous creatures in there, Elijah never saw them. Instead, everything seemed out to kill everything else, which meant that the entire place was a natural battlefield of epic proportions. And that posed quite a problem. If he'd been capable of adopting his panther form, he could have simply snuck through. However, in his human form, he had no more ability in stealth than any other person. Certainly, he'd learned a few tricks over the past year of living in the wilderness, but most of his knowledge was useless in his current environment. The third thing he was forced to realize was that he wasn't nearly as buoyant as he might have expected, which meant that swimming really was out of the question. In fact, after a little testing, he reasoned that it wasn't so different from the level of gravity on the moon. And finally, he acknowledged that, once again, the water was free of salt, which seemed even more incongruous than the massive predators or clearly contrived scenario. But at least it meant that he wouldn't die of thirst if he remained on the level for too long. Food would be an issue, though, largely because he'd lost his woven satchel sometime during the transition between levels. Hopefully, he would complete the task before he had to start considering eating the fish and other creatures he'd seen so far. After a few hours, Elijah realized that he was stalling. He really didn't want to head into the forest of kelp and corral, largely because he felt incredibly vulnerable without his shape of the predator spell. He still had Storm's Fury, though he wasn't entirely certain it would work underwater. And he had his newest spell, Swarm. But other than that, he only had his staff to defend himself. And he suspected that that wouldn't be enough. Letting out a sigh that sent a series of bubbles drifting toward the surface, Elijah pushed the negative thoughts aside. He'd survived cancer. He had learned to thrive after being stranded on a deserted island. He'd killed a host of interdimensional lizards. He could stroll across the seabed and kill some boss monster. If that was what he had to do to survive, then that was what he was going to do. The first order of business was to test Storm's Fury, though. So, he backed away from his rock and embraced the spell. To his shock, a veritable torrent of Ethera swept through his mind, and Storm's Fury activated in a fraction of the time it normally took. The moment the spell was saturated, he released his hold, and a thick bolt of white lightning tore across the water and hit the rock. It shattered, sending bits and pieces slowly flying through the water. Elijah grinned. It was definitely stronger, but he wasn't sure why. Was it the interaction with the water? Or was it the denser ambient Ethera? He had no way of knowing. Testing it again, he fired off another spell. This time, though, he paid attention to the bolt of lightning itself. In its normal form, the lightning manifested from the sky, but when he channeled it through his staff of natural harmony, it emanated from the head of the weapon. But it always took the form of a single, well-defined bolt of lightning. Underwater, that changed. From that single bolt extended a series of smaller branches of electricity, suggesting that it could affect a larger area of effect. The radius around the bolt wasn't large, maybe a few feet before those branches dissipated, but it was enough to excite Elijah about his chances of making it through the Sea of Sorrows. He decided to test Swarm as well. To his surprise, though, when he tried, it wouldn't activate. It only took a moment for Elijah to realize that, like Shape of the Predator, the spell would take the bulk of his Ethera reserves to cast. So, he retreated a little and settled in to meditate on funneling Ethera through his mind and into his soul, after which it settled into his core. He was well used to the process by that point, but he still reveled in the feeling of so much energy flowing through the ephemeral system. Eventually, Elijah regenerated enough Ethera to fuel the spell. So, he rose and channeled it through his staff. A moment later, a school of tiny fish, they looked a lot like piranha, appeared and swept through the area. Without anything to attack, they dissipated only a few moments later. Interesting. According to the spell's description, the creatures would infect his enemies with appropriate afflictions, whatever that meant. Elijah didn't know, and he wouldn't find out until he used the spell on an enemy. He hoped it wouldn't come to that, but given the nature of the tower, he suspected that his hopes would soon be dashed. After testing the spell, Elijah settled in to once again regenerate his Ethera, and once his core was full, he finally set off, bounding across the seafloor with long, bouncy steps that helped him cover the ground very quickly. However, he chose to hesitate when he reached the edge of the kelp forest. Was going in the right choice? Maybe. Perhaps not. But he couldn't think of any other option. So, without further ado, he plunged ahead. This time, though, he kept his footsteps short, and he stayed as low as he could. His attempts at stealth turned out to be useless. Only 10 steps into the kelp forest, he passed what he thought was an innocuous rock. But the moment his back was exposed, he felt the water stir. With instincts born of surviving for a year in the wilderness, he dove forward. It wasn't enough. Something clamped down on his side, ripping into the delicate flesh. His momentum tore him free, and whatever had attacked him pulled back. Blood as well as bits of skin and meat misted into the water as Elijah slapped his hand to his side and pulsed touch of nature. He hit the seabed hard before bouncing into a tall stalk of kelp. Even as the spell staunched the bleeding, he got his first glimpse of his attacker. It was a turtle, though a species Elijah did not recognize. The sharp beak and leathery skin were familiar, but its shell was made entirely from rock and coral. More, its legs were far longer than any turtle Elijah had ever seen. And finally, it was at least as big as he was, and it probably weighed at least 300 pounds. Probably a lot more. In short, it looked like a primal version of a snapping turtle with a jagged boulder for a shell. Elijah didn't hesitate to cast Storm's Fury the moment he recovered from his tumble. The monster, and that was the only way he could think of the creature, saw the spell coming, and displaying more intelligence than any reptile had a right to show, it twisted around to present its shell. The lightning hit it, splintering the shell and eliciting a burbling scream from the turtle. It reacted instantly, leaping across the intervening space and latching onto Elijah's hastily raised arm. Bone crunched as its jaws closed, but Elijah kept his wits about him as he recast the spell. The lightning hit the creature square between the eyes, but even though it was clearly hurt, the thing channeled its inner pit bull and refused to relinquish its grip. So, Elijah recast the spell. Twice. 3 more times. And as his Ethera dipped to dangerously low levels, the creature finally died. But its jaws remained locked into place, and its weight tugged Elijah to the seafloor. Pain lanced through him. His arm was broken, probably in multiple places, and his side was still missing quite a bit of flesh. He only had enough Ethera for 2 heals. Maybe 3 at most. And he had a turtle latched onto his arm. Prying it loose was the first order of business. Then, he intended, just then, a school of small fish, maybe 7 or 8 inches long, with gold scales and red, beady eyes, swam into view. They made a beeline for the bloody waters surround Elijah. Recognizing them for the predatory scavengers they were, Elijah took aim with his staff and cast Storm's Fury. Lightning arced out, taking the little creature's head on. But the bolt of electricity was so powerful that it didn't stop after obliterating the first. No, it kept going, tearing through the school. That's when the little branches of lightning showed their worth, leaping out to fry most of the remaining fish. The majority of the school died in an instant, but a few managed to survive. But suddenly alone, they weren't nearly as brave as they'd been only a moment before, and they quickly darted back under the cover of the kelp forest. Elijah felt his shoulders sag. He'd killed the little creatures, but that victory had come at a cost. His core was entirely empty now. So, he couldn't heal himself. Grimacing, he realized that he had no choice but to retreat. But first, he needed to pry the turtle's jaws apart. So, over the next couple of minutes, he awkwardly did just that. In the end, he had to lever his foot under one side while tugging the other in the opposite direction. And just like that, he was free. It only took one look at his arm to tell him that he'd severely underestimated the damage. He was a marine biologist, but he was familiar enough with mammalian physiology to know that, if he didn't have access to healing magic, he would lose the arm. It was already swollen to nearly 3 times its normal size, and bits of bone jutted through the purpling skin. That served to further cement Elijah's decision to retreat. Letting out a gurgling sigh, he returned to his previous spot and settled in to regenerate his Ethera. Without the adrenaline of the fight pumping through his veins, he felt every pulse of agony emanating from his arm. The only good thing he could say was that it at least served as a distraction from the injury on his right side. Silver linings, he supposed. As he sat there, he began to come to the realization that he might be on his current level of the tower for a little longer than expected. Elijah knelt behind a fallen chunk of coral. In one hand, he clutched his staff, while the other kept him from drifting with the current as he watched the scene laid out before him. It had been nearly a week since he'd first entered the 2nd level of the tower, and in that time, he'd been forced to learn to adapt to life in the sea. At first, it had not gone well, and he'd spent most of the first few days recovering from the brief, intense battles that plagued every step into the kelp and coral forest. But with every fight, he drew a little closer to gaining enough power to traverse the sea with impunity. He still wasn't there yet, having only reached level 23, but he felt like he was on the verge of gaining another level. And when he did, he would learn a new spell or ability. Hopefully, that would make his task easier to accomplish. Which was why he was watching the giant eel lazily drifting back and forth in the current. It hadn't moved from the small clearing in some time, and Elijah knew that, if he was going to kill it, he needed to act soon, lest he lose his chance when the thing woke up and wandered off. So, he screwed up his courage, then leaped up, grabbing a piece of branching coral, and dragged himself atop the edifice. Once there, he raised his staff and dragged Ethera from his core, channeled it through his soul, and cast Swarm. Instantly, 1,000 piranha-like fish manifested and swept down into the clearing. The eel never saw them coming. In seconds, the little fish, which were barely bigger than Elijah's fingers, had torn huge chunks from its flesh. More importantly, with each bite, they delivered an affliction that, so far as Elijah could tell, functioned like the necrotic damage associated with brown recluse spiders. Only it was much accelerated and far more powerful. The degradation of the tissue surrounding such a bite would normally take as much as 2 weeks, but once magic became involved, as was the case with the fish conjured by Swarm, it only took moments. Instantly, the eel's brown and gray serpentine body was riddled with red blisters, which quickly turned white, and soon after, burst with pus and blood. The eel didn't take the attack lying down either. It twisted and struck, biting at the swarm of creatures. When its jaws clamped down on them, they burst into clear goo that dissipated only a second later. Over and over, the eel attacked the swarm of biting fish, but it only got a fraction of the creatures before the spell ended. All the while, Elijah waited, hoping against hope that the damage would be enough to take the monster down. Because of the extreme Ethera cost, this was the first time he'd used the spell in battle, and though it hadn't disappointed, Elijah couldn't help but hold his metaphorical breath as the thing slowly succumbed to the necrotic venom. Over the next few minutes, it thrashed and bucked, clearly in pain. Elijah hated watching the animal suffer, but he didn't dare intervene. He'd learned to fear the denizens of the Sea of Sorrows, and though his heart bled for his victims, it wasn't enough to throw himself into undue danger. Gradually, the eel's thrashing ceased, and it sank to the silt-covered seabed. But it was still alive. And worse, the sores that were the result of the creature's bites had begun to close. If Elijah judged it correctly, it wouldn't be too much longer before the eel started to recover from its internal injuries, which were almost assuredly much more severe than the bites and burst blisters on its skin. No, if he was going to kill the thing, he needed to act. Fortunately, in the minutes since he'd cast Swarm, he'd recovered enough Ethera to fuel a few casts of Storm's Fury. Hopefully, that would be enough to end the monster's life and give him the kill energy he needed to progress. If not, then he would have to find another vulnerable creature and start the process over again. It was not precisely the way Elijah wanted to live. After all, the eel was probably inedible, and even if it wasn't, there was no way he was going to use that much meat, but that was the reality that he'd been forced to confront. Killing was necessary for survival. It always had been, but that was even more true than it had been back on his island. There he'd killed so he could eat, or to protect the island and his grove from the Vox. But now, he was killing simply because he needed to grow more powerful. It wasn't exactly killing for the sake of killing, but it wasn't so far off that he didn't see the parallels, either. Regardless, he had already come to terms with it. He'd resolved to survive by whatever means necessary, and so, that was precisely what he was going to do. However, he did recognize that there would come a point in time where he needed to have a better plan than that. In short, he needed a code by which he would live. But for now, what he really needed most was for that eel to die, and no moral debate would change that. So, without further delay, he once again raised his staff, took aim at the eel, and used Storm's Fury. Lightning, hot and furious, arced out from his staff of natural harmony and hit the eel directly in the forehead. The moment the spell hit, the creature seized, but Elijah knew it wouldn't be enough. So, he used the spell again, draining the last of his Ethera. More convulsions followed until, at last, It fell still and settled onto the seabed in a cloud of silt. But the thing didn't die. Elijah knew that because he hadn't received the expected influx of kill energy. So, he had a choice. Either he could wait for his Ethera to regenerate and chance the monster healing the damage he'd just done. Or he could go down there and finish it off the hard way. Both options had downsides. But considering that one of the choices' downside was that he'd get eaten the moment he got within range of the creature, he chose the first option. So, once again he settled down to wait. As he did, he focused on funneling as much Ethera as he could through his mind and into his core, but when the eel started to stir, he knew it wouldn't be enough. Still, he refused to move. Killing the eel was the goal, and he'd put everything he had into doing just that. But he refused to let that sway his judgment. Instead, he ignored the sunk cost and focused on the most important thing, staying alive. So, he watched as, before he'd even regenerated enough Ethera to fuel 2 casts of Storm's Fury, the eel awoke. The moment it did, the creature swam away, taking Elijah's chance at gaining level 24 with it. But at least he was still alive. It was just further proof that, while his archetype was versatile and, in the right situation, deadly, it just didn't give him the kick he needed to easily kill most of the creatures in the Sea of Sorrows. If he'd had access to Shape of the Predator, things would be very different. He could have snuck up on the eel and ravaged it with Predator Strike, then finished it off with a combination of Contagion and the kind of hit-and-run tactics he'd used against the water goblins on the previous level. But his Mist Panther form was almost entirely incapable of swimming, which ruled that strategy out. He sighed, sending a trail of tiny bubbles drifting toward the surface. It seemed that he wasn't going to progress via one big kill. Instead, he'd need to target the smaller creatures he'd been hunting since he'd entered the Sea of Sorrows. Once the eel had been gone for a few minutes, Elijah climbed down from his perch and took a familiar route back to the shallow cave he'd been using as a temporary base of operations. When he got there, he looked at it with a sense of blended nostalgia and fatigue. The first, because it reminded him of his earliest days on the island, when even killing a crab had been difficult. The second, for the same reasons. It felt like it had been so long since he'd been able to just relax. Survival, for all that it was periodically exciting, was incredibly exhausting, and, at times, he longed for the days when he could just go home after a long day of work, kick off his shoes, and read a good book. Or watch some trash television. Or any of a number of other wastes of time that came from having most of his needs met. It wasn't as if he intended to give up. He didn't. But he would have appreciated a short break, all the same. That wasn't in the cards, though. He'd only made it a few miles into the kelp forest, and he knew he had at least that much left to go before he reached the center of the Sea of Sorrows. So rest would have to wait. Perhaps indefinitely, if his experiences since the world had been transformed were any indication. But it wasn't that bad, really. With the water being fresh, he didn't run the risk of dehydration. And he'd killed enough fish, crustaceans, and other creatures that hunger wasn't an issue either. Sure, he had to eat it raw. Fire didn't burn underwater, after all, but ingesting unsafe food was nothing that a quick pulse of touch of nature couldn't take care of. So, he had no issues with meeting his basic needs. As he settled into his cave to rest, Elijah let his mind drift until, at last, he fell asleep. He awoke some indeterminate time later. After all, without the steady rise and setting of the sun, he had no real concept of how much time had passed. He once again set off. Soon enough, he was attacked by a small sea serpent, which he killed with a quick cast of Storm's Fury. Once it was dead, he ate a bit of its meat, then discarded the rest before moving on. He met a similar ambush by a sea spider with the same tactics, though he ended up having to bash the thing apart with his staff after it survived the onslaught of spells that drained his pool of Ethera. He didn't eat any of the spider because, well, he drew the line at arachnids. Like that, Elijah slowly progressed, and a day later, he finally achieved his goal. Congratulations! You have reached level 24. Attribute points allocated according to your class. The notification came after he'd killed the second of a trio of giant, foot-long shrimp by clobbering it with his staff, and the shock of it very nearly got him killed when the lone survivor launched itself at him. Elijah barely managed to block its attack with his staff, knocking it aside before following up with a hastily cast Storm's Fury. It drained the last of his Ethera, he'd already cast it a handful of times, missing the little creatures more than he wanted to admit, but the resulting bolt of lightning took the stunned creature head-on, completely obliterating it. Elijah's shoulders slumped. He'd been at it for hours, and after finally reaching his goal, his exhaustion finally caught up to him. However, he couldn't afford to rest. Not until he reached some modicum of safety. So, without even looking at his status or whatever new spell or ability he'd gained, he set off to find a safe haven. It took longer than he hoped, but eventually he found a dense clump of coral that seemed promising. So, he trudged into what turned out to be a tiny cave. The only problem was that it already had a resident in the form of a sizable catfish that did not appreciate being disturbed. By that point, Elijah had enough Ethera to cast Storm's Fury a couple of times, but judging by the size of the thing, and the famous durability of catfish, he considered retreat a better option. So, after narrowly avoiding the creature's initial salvo, he leaped for the entrance and dragged himself out. Thankfully, the catfish didn't follow. After a few more failures, Elijah finally discovered another cave that would serve as a decent resting spot, at least for a few hours. So, he headed inside and spent the next few minutes arduously inspecting the interior for threats. He found none, so he dragged a few pieces of coral in front of the entrance and finally settled down to rest. Though he struggled to keep his eyes open, Elijah forced himself to take a look at his status, just in case anything had changed. Elijah Hart, level 24, archetype, Druid, class, animist, specialization, not applicable, alignment, not applicable, strength, 25, dexterity, 29-24, constitution, 30-25, 33, regeneration, 27, movement, nature, cultivation, body, formed, neophyte. Unsurprisingly, aside from gaining 2 points in each attribute since he'd last checked, nothing had changed. And while he appreciated the additional attributes, Elijah was far more interested in his new ability. So, without further delay, he took a look at it. Ability, Venom Strike, imbues an attack with fast-acting neurotoxin. Usable in all forms. Damage doubled when in predator form. Elijah didn't really know what to think of it. On the one hand, it certainly opened up a lot of possibilities, especially after he realized that the ability didn't actually take Ethera. Even though all he wanted was to rest, Elijah took a few minutes to try it out, and what he discovered was that even though it didn't use Ethera, it still had a cost. The first time he used the ability, he felt a sudden wave of fatigue. The second time, it was stronger. And the third nearly wiped him out. It was an odd feeling, somewhere between the fatigue associated with a high fever and the result of a long workout. He could probably force himself to use it a few more times, especially if he was fresh, but eventually he would simply collapse from exhaustion. But that was fine. It just gave him one more tool to survive, and eventually, if he kept stacking advantages and abilities, he would make it out of the tower. Elijah was exhausted. It wasn't just the constant danger, though that was a big part of it. Nor was it the raw fish that had become his diet. He'd even grown accustomed to the taste of the water. No, what really got to him was the constant submersion. People just weren't meant to live underwater, as evidenced by the fact that his skin had started to break down only a few days into his time in the Sea of Sorrows. On top of that, if he didn't consistently use Touch of Nature to counteract some of the other effects, like the degradation of his muscles due to the decreased weight and the havoc submersion wrought on his circulatory system, he would have already died. But as valuable as Touch of Nature was, it did nothing to combat the psychological effects. Isolation was difficult on its own, but he'd been dealing with that for more than a year. However, when it was compounded by living for more than a month in such an alien environment, it became nearly unbearable. There were only 2 reasons he'd managed to keep going. First, and most importantly, he didn't have any choice. He was a survivor, and after being given a second chance at life, Elijah simply refused to give in. With that driving him, he didn't really have any choice in the matter. The same factors that had driven him to enter the tower in the first place, chiefly, the fact that he would be overwhelmed by the Vox if he didn't, kept him moving forward. The second reason he'd managed to maintain his sanity was that, despite the hostility of the environment, he was consistently struck by the beauty all around him. He'd never been a particularly committed biologist. Certainly, he'd enjoyed his work well enough, but he wasn't nearly as driven as some of his colleagues. Work was work, and he was content with keeping it separated from the rest of his life. However, spending so much time in the Sea of Sorrows had opened his eyes in a way that nothing else ever had. If he hadn't been trapped there, he might have even enjoyed himself, so long as he could get out of the water and enjoy dry land. In any case, in the previous weeks, he had seen a host of things no one else ever had, and despite the fact that he desperately wanted to leave the Sea of Sorrows, he couldn't help but appreciate it for the beauty it represented. Even the predators, especially them, filled him with awe. But for now, he needed to focus on the task at hand. If he didn't, the sea wouldn't have to kill him because his foe would do the job instead. Crouched behind a half-eaten carcass of what he thought had once been a whale, Elijah studied the creature he'd decided to kill. From Elijah's perspective, it looked like a giant isopod, with emphasis on the giant part. As seemed common within the Sea of Sorrows, and the transformed world at large, a creature that should have topped out at around 20 inches long had reached truly gargantuan proportions. If it was smaller than a minivan, Elijah would have been incredibly surprised. More distressing than its size were the other addendums to its morphology. Chiefly, that its legs, all 14 of them, were quite a bit longer than the species with which Elijah was familiar. That, in and of itself, wouldn't have been terribly distressing, but the limbs were also barbed, which told him all he needed to know about their purpose. Its shell also looked quite a bit thicker than it should have been, though, given Elijah's experiences with the crabs on his island, that was expected. Otherwise, the creature looked much like its terrestrial native, the humble wood louse, or the pillbug, as they were usually known. Though instead of a black shell, the giant isopod was equipped with a much lighter-colored armor. Regardless, Elijah had chosen the monster as his target for 2 reasons. First, after killing the whale and gorging itself, the isopod had grown quite lethargic. That would give him some leeway in his method of attack. Most importantly, though, Elijah knew that if he didn't kill it, it would almost assuredly hunt him down. Because the overgrown crustacean was very territorial, and it killed anything that dared set foot, or fin, into its territory. The whale, as well as a dozen other, much smaller creatures, was proof enough of that. No, if Elijah wanted to continue to progress toward the center of the Sea of Sorrows, he needed to get past the isopod. And if he couldn't? Then, he had no business challenging the level's guardian in the first place. But just because it was necessary didn't mean Elijah was looking forward to it. He wasn't. In fact, he was almost certain he was going to die in the effort. However, he was tired of the sea, and he knew that if he didn't make progress soon, his resolution to keep going would begin to wane. He wouldn't just give up, but every day he spent in that sea robbed him of some ineffable aspect of his motivation, and without that, he would lose focus and make mistakes that would eventually get him killed. Still, he considered simply going back and continuing to hunt. There was no shortage of prey, and eventually he would gain more levels. Though over the past few days, he'd gotten the feeling that kill energy was subject to diminishing returns. Killing things within the Sea of Sorrows would still let him progress, but the longer he stayed, the more it would take. Elijah wasn't sure how he knew that. There was no numerical value or anything associated with how much kill energy he needed to level, but he knew it all the same. Not for the first time, Elijah wished he had someone to explain everything to him. Or failing that, a companion with which he could compare notes. Nerthus was great, and he'd been extremely helpful, but he was obviously very limited in what information he could pass on. Shaking his head, Elijah realized that he was just stalling. So, he stepped out from behind the whale and used Storm's Fury. Lightning lanced out from the tip of his staff, hitting the dormant monster directly in its eye. But Elijah didn't see it. Instead, he used the spell again, to similar results. The creature stirred, locking its eyes on Elijah. He tried to cast another instance of Storm's Fury, but he cut it off when the monster raced toward him. Propelled by its multitude of legs, the isopod could move incredibly quickly, and as such, Elijah knew he didn't have time to dawdle. Instead, he turned and ran. Moving quickly in the water required a curious mix of jumping, paddling, and running, but over the previous month, Elijah had been forced to master the awkward technique. As such, he managed to get away just before the isopod reached his previous position. Clicking its mandibles furiously, it dug its sharp legs into the silt and launched itself at Elijah. But by that point, Elijah was already gone, darting between a pair of coral stalks and into a stand of kelp. The isopod thundered after him, crushing the coral and tearing through the waving kelp. Elijah never stopped moving, though he was careful not to outpace the monster. Not that that was a real possibility. It was native to the environment, and despite its bulk, the thing was well equipped for rapid movement. So, Elijah struggled to stay ahead of it. Leaping over a wide but relatively shallow chasm, Elijah landed with a roll before finding his feet and continuing his flight. A turtle not unlike the one who'd first greeted him snapped at him in passing, but by that point, Elijah was already gone. Just when he thought he was going to be caught, he got a boost of speed as the system finally judged that he'd left combat. The monster still chased him, but because he hadn't taken any hostile action or damage for a while, his essence of the wolf kicked in. Though it was expected, he'd tested it thoroughly, it still came as a welcome relief, and he quickly put some extra distance between himself and the giant sea louse. After a few dozen more yards, he looked back to see that the creature had all but given up. So, mustering his Ethera, Elijah launched another storm's fury in its direction. From that distance, all he could manage was a glancing blow, but it was enough to renew the monster's ire. Like that, Elijah ran the thing in circles until, at last, he came to the spot he'd prepared ahead of time. It wasn't a very artful trap. Indeed, any creature with even basic intelligence would know to avoid it. But Elijah was banking on the creature being no more intelligent than the giant isopods with which he was familiar. So, he'd built the trap, which consisted of a few arduously sharpened bones arranged within a cave he had stumbled upon. The cave itself was characterized by a large overhang just above the entrance, and it was only just large enough for the monster to fit. Even though it was a tight fit, the monster still followed when Elijah dashed inside. As he wove through the stakes and into the much narrower back of the cave, Elijah shot another storm's fury at the monster. It ran headlong into the cave, impaling itself on the angled stakes Elijah had carved from another whale carcass he'd stumbled upon a few days before. But that wasn't enough to kill such a creature. Nor would it suffice to trap it. And with its long legs, it was only a matter of time before the thing escaped. Elijah had a plan for that too. He had chosen his killing ground well, and though the cave hadn't initially had two openings, the wall at the narrow end was thin enough that it had only taken him a few hours to carve a hole big enough for him to fit through. So, he dragged himself through, then circled around to the entrance. Once there, he aimed his staff at the overhang above the entrance and let loose with another storm's fury. He'd spent hours making certain that the overhang was weak enough that it would only take a single cast to send the rock and coral tumbling down. And that was precisely what happened, the ensuing avalanche sealing that side of the cave and trapping the giant isopod inside. Elijah pumped his fist in celebration, but judging by the rumbling coming from within the cave, he knew he didn't have time to pat himself on the back. He still had a giant crustacean to kill. So, he circled back around to what was now the lone exit. Then, he settled in to wait for his Ethera to regenerate. It only took a little while. After all, that was one of the reasons he'd led the creature on such a long chase. Before he had enough Ethera to cast Swarm. He pointed his staff into the hole and did just that. He couldn't see the piranha that the spell conjured, but he didn't need to because, only a second later, an unholy burbling screech came from within the cave. Elijah knew the conjuration wouldn't last long, just 30 seconds or so, but the screeching endured well after. At the same time, the monster never stopped trying to escape. The other reason Elijah had circled the trap so many times was because he'd wanted to tire it out. He didn't know if it had worked, but with its massive size, even when it was exhausted and wounded, it was more than capable of breaking free. But Elijah was committed, now. Everything had gone precisely how he'd planned it. He just needed to finish things off. Which was easier said than done, and over the next 30 minutes, he listened to the monster's screeches and attempts to escape its fate. At the same time, his Ethera continued to regenerate until, at last, he was able to cast Swarm once again. The results were predictable. More screeches. More localized earthquakes as the isopod tried to break free. But still it didn't die. So, Elijah waited. And cast Swarm. Then waited some more. By the time the monster finally keeled over, giving Elijah enough kill energy to progress to level 25, it had nearly broken free of the trap. And it had taken 7 casts of Swarm to do it in. When it died, Elijah stood atop that half-destroyed mound, looking down at the massive monster he'd just killed, and basked in the satisfaction that, despite being handicapped by his inability to transform, he'd emerged victorious. That was probably why he never saw his inevitable death bearing down on him. Alyssa swung her spear in a long arc, severing a series of saplings in one swing. As she did so, she let out a shout of anger and frustration. "I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Carmen didn't make that thing so you could use it to cut down trees," said Bryce, the party's wizard. He specialized in long-casting, hard-hitting spells that could change the shape of any battle, but he exchanged that ability for any personal survivability. Most classes were equipped with some sort of ability that helped keep them alive, but wizards were one of the few exceptions. As a result, he was definitely the kind of a glass cannon who was almost solely reliant on someone else to be effective. "Like it matters," Kevin, the group's healer, said. He was a short, dumpy man with a crown of shaggy hair, and he'd taken the Rejuvenator class, which meant that he specialized in efficiency and healing over time. As with every other class, though, that specialization came at the expense of versatility. His healing spells took time to work their magic, and as a result, he wasn't great for emergency situations. But a healer was a healer, and they were rare enough that nobody could be particularly picky. "I've seen that thing go through a brick wall and not get a scratch. Wish I could convince her to make me something." "If you're using a weapon, you're doing something wrong," Bryce stated. Tall, weedy, and awkward, he clearly hadn't allocated many of his attribute points into any of the physical categories. But from what Alyssa had seen, he had Ethera for days, and he regenerated it extremely quickly. "Or you are," Kevin pointed out. "I mean, I'm dependent on jabronis like you too." "That word makes you sound like an idiot," said the final member of their party, Lisa. She occupied the scout role, but she was more of a damage dealer than anything else. Alyssa had no idea what the woman's class was. She wasn't keen on volunteering anything, but that wasn't a huge deal. She did her job, and that was all that really mattered. "What word?" "Jabroni?" Kevin asked. Bryce said, "I think it's cool. You should definitely keep using it at every opportunity." "Do I sense some sarcasm? From me?" "I would never." "I hate you both," Kevin muttered. "Same Z's," Bryce said with a grin. "That word makes you sound just as stupid as him," Lisa said. "In fact, I think being around you two is having a negative effect on my own intelligence." "I'm going scouting." She looked at Alyssa, asking, "That all right, boss?" Alyssa nodded, and the woman flitted off into the wilderness. If Alyssa really wanted to, she could have kept track of her. She certainly wasn't as adept at stealth as Roman. But that was fine. For a normal patrol, her skills were adequate for their purposes. As the group continued on, Alyssa struggled to keep her mind on the task at hand. Not because of the banter between the remaining members of the patrol party, but rather because her mind was nestled firmly back in Easton. The settlement's name was no new addition. Indeed, it had been in place since they'd made the connection to the World Tree, but Alyssa still had difficulty thinking of it as anything but the settlement. Easton had been the now-defunct town where they'd lived before the world's transformation, not the settlement they'd managed to cobble together from the ruins of a lost civilization. In any case, Alyssa wasn't frustrated with names. In fact, she should have been happy. Things were looking up, and it appeared that they'd passed through the worst of the transition. The problem, though, was Roman. He'd never been much for compassion, and after Trish's death, his heart had further hardened. He didn't care much for the sanctity of human life. Instead, he looked at everything with the eyes of a man who was only concerned with the prosperity of the settlement as a whole. That meant that if someone couldn't pull their weight, Roman wanted to get rid of them. The same could be said for any refugees who happened to stumble on them. Most recently, he'd turned a group of 30 away because they didn't possess what he considered useful classes. Or not enough of them, at least. If they couldn't contribute to Easton's immediate needs, then they had no place in the town. He'd turned them away without a second thought, and Alyssa hadn't found out about it until they were already gone. When she chased them down, they'd been attacked by a herd of monsters, and the majority had been killed. She'd brought the survivors back to Easton, but saving those few wasn't enough to assuage her conscience. And the worst of it was that she knew that if another group came while she was gone, they'd be turned away too. She understood Roman's stance. There were only so many people they could support. Despite the fruition of the attempts to grow crops and their constant efforts to hunt more game, there was only so much food to go around. More living conditions were still crowded, and while they were constantly building more houses, it was a slow process that had left quite a few people crammed into small domiciles. They were surviving, but they were a long way from thriving. As a result, taking on more refugees was a bad idea. Alyssa knew that, but she didn't accept the ramifications. She would go without if it meant someone else had a chance to live, and she suspected that many of Easton's residents thought the same thing. Or she hoped so, at least. Before leaving on the current scouting expedition, she'd had another argument with Roman about it, but neither had been willing to budge. She trusted the man, and she knew he meant well, but they just couldn't come to a consensus about how to approach the subject. More than once, she'd thought about how much easier things would be if they simply broke apart and went their separate ways. If she hadn't had Carmen and Miguel to worry about, she might have already done it. Shaking her head as she looked around, she realized how untrue that was. For better or worse, she cared about the people of Easton too much to abandon them, especially over people she'd never even met. So, as much as she wanted to save everyone, Alyssa knew precisely where her priorities lay. "You all right, boss?" asked Kevin. "I'm fine if," she said. "Just stressed is all." "For what it's worth, we agree with you," Bryce said, adopting an uncharacteristically serious tone. As far as Alyssa knew, the man had approached the world like it was one of the video games he'd played before the world ended. It had served him well, giving him some insight into the inner workings of the system. However, it also meant that he sometimes failed to take things seriously, instead approaching it like he'd simply respawn if things went wrong. He wasn't the only one either. More than once, Alyssa had considered the possibility that the world's integration into the larger universe had been a large enough change that it had broken people's minds. Not completely. Not with the ones who'd survived, at least. But just enough that they weren't truly certain if what they saw was real. Alyssa said, "You're a good man, Bryce. Don't let yourself forget that. Now eyes up. You know how dangerous it is out here." For the next hour, they continued on their patrol, passing through the old town along the way. The vegetation had experienced explosive growth over the spring and summer, and as a result, many of the buildings had been enveloped by creeping vines and blankets of moss. Thankfully, though, they didn't encounter any monsters. They were out there, Alyssa was certain. They always were. In that respect, it wasn't unlike walking through the woods before the integration. Back then, animals were all around, they were just good at staying hidden. The mutated versions of the New World were much the same, and most avoided humanity as much as possible. The patrols were there to combat the other ones. The type that preyed on humans and killed indiscriminately. There were plenty of those as well, which meant that the patrols were an absolute and dangerous necessity. Almost an hour after she left them, Lisa returned. The slender girl, she couldn't have been older than 19, slipped from between a pair of overgrown buildings, saying, "Boss, you need to see this." "What is it?" "I genuinely don't know." "That doesn't sound good," Alyssa muttered, but she directed the others to follow Lisa as the scout led them across the abandoned and mostly destroyed town. Along the way, Alyssa saw a few smaller animals, and she even caught sight of a couple of skeletons that had once been human beings. They hadn't had the chance to properly bury the people who died right after the integration, and so they'd been left out to rot. Or for the scavengers to gorge themselves. Finally, Lisa pointed at the old hardware store and said, "In there?" "What?" "I don't know. It's some kind of, I don't know. A hole in space or something. It's weird. Once I saw it, I didn't go any closer, but I wasn't so far away that I didn't feel it." "Feel what?" asked Bryce. He carried a staff, though he didn't know how to use it. It was more of an affectation for the wizard. "The scaled monsters," she said. "Like that, but different. Wrong, you know?" They all nodded. Each of them had felt it, so they knew precisely what she was talking about. "Okay," Alyssa said. "Bryce and Kev, to the rear. Lisa, flanking. If something comes, I'll pin it down. Everyone else do what you do." They drilled the strategy dozens of times, and it worked great against the comparatively weak wildlife. Against the scaled monsters, the Vox, Alyssa had read in one of the guides she'd bought off the branch, it was only moderately effective. It was fine when they only faced the weaker versions, but against something like the creature that had killed Trish, it would be woefully inadequate. If they fought something like that, Alyssa intended to tell her team to run while she tied it up. They probably wouldn't obey that order, though. In any case, they couldn't leave something like that free, let alone something that sounded suspiciously like the dimensional rifts Alyssa had read about. She'd made those guides available for anyone who wanted to read them, but few people had the time or the inclination to learn more than was absolutely necessary. Survival was enough to occupy the whole of their minds. Follow? Then, Alyssa advanced, passing through the shattered frame that had once held a pane of glass. When she stepped inside, she was assailed by a musty smell and a subtle undercurrent of what she could only interpret as corruption. Overgrown with moss and fungi, the interior of the old hardware store looked like it had been abandoned for decades rather than a little less than a year. An effect of the ambient Ethera, she reasoned. What remained of the shelves was empty, having been picked clean by scavenger teams, so there was nothing useful aside from a few mushrooms that looked like an edible variety. She marked it in her mind, intending to direct the gatherers to the small cache of potential food. Slowly they advanced. The store was a local mom-and-pop operation, or at least it had been before the world ended, so it didn't take long to reach the rear. When the group did, Alyssa saw the anomaly that had garnered Lisa's attention. Suspended a few inches above the floor, it was a gaping hole with jagged, purple-glowing edges that looked like some interdimensional being had ripped a hole in the fabric of reality. The interior of the portal, and that was clearly what it was pitch black, offering no visibility. "We have to go in," she said. Asked Kevin. "That sounds like the kind of thing someone says before they're violently murdered," Bryce pointed out. "I hate to agree with him, but Bryce is right," Lisa agreed. "Wait, why do you hate to agree with me?" "I'm smart," he argued. "You're stupid smart. Like, you know plenty of things, but, well, you're stupid too. That makes no sense." "Doesn't have to." "Shut up," Alyssa said. "That's a dimensional rift. A minor one by the looks of it. If we don't close it, it's going to burst and we'll get a flood of those scaled monsters. If we go in, though, we can close it. And we'll be rewarded for it too." "No offense, boss, but we'd have to be alive to get a reward," Bryce said. "That's the idea, yeah? But if it's got one of those big monsters inside, it won't. It'll be one we can handle." "You know that?" he asked. "No," Alyssa said. "Not for sure. But everything I've read suggests we should be able to do this. More importantly, we're here. If we take the time to go back, it might burst. If that happens, people will die. And if we go in there, we might be the ones to die," said Kevin. "Maybe," Alyssa acknowledged. "But maybe not." "Fine. I'm in," said Bryce. Kevin looked at him like he'd said something crazy. "Look, we've got the boss here. If we're ever going to earn our pay—" "We don't get paid," Kevin pointed out. "Whatever. You know what I mean. If we're ever going to do something like this, now's the time when we've got the best chance of surviving. Plus, I'm close to leveling." "This isn't a game, Bryce," said Kevin. "I'm aware," he replied, a bit of steel in his voice. Like everyone else, he'd lost people, and every now and again he let the carefree mask slip. "I'm going in," Alyssa said, cutting the conversation off. "You can come in with me if you want. Or not. If you don't, we're obviously coming with you, boss." "Yeah." Lisa added, "I'm in." "All right. Let's do this," Alyssa said, forcing a smile. She appreciated their loyalty and faith, but she also knew what was probably on the other side of that gate. So, she took a deep breath, then stepped forward into hell. After a blink-and-you'll-miss-it period of black nothingness, Alyssa stumbled into a rocky landscape. Upon crossing that threshold, the first thing she saw was a sky of roiling, purple fire, but soon after, she took in the gray terrain with rivers of purple liquid cutting through it. More importantly, she saw the creature. Even as the others staggered out of the gate, the Viridian monster, 4 arms, 2 legs, and a face like a salamander, rumbled forward. It was big, a little over 6 feet tall and bulging with rippling muscles. Alyssa didn't hesitate to act. Using heroic leap, she launched herself into the sky. The monster stopped its charge, seemingly surprised by what it saw. At the apex of her leap, she used Descending Dragon, which sent her plummeting toward the ground like a falling meteor. She led the way with the spear of the Dragon Lancer, which sliced through the monster's scales, pierced through its thick muscles, and erupted from between its 4 shoulder blades. Then her weight hit it, knocking it onto its back. The blade of her spear bit deep into the ground, pinning the creature in place. However, Alyssa didn't escape unharmed. The moment she landed on its chest, the Voxian monster went insane, and with all 4 of its claws, tried to rip her to pieces. She sprang away in a black flip that sent a cascade of blood raining onto the landscape, then landed on unsteady legs. Then she felt the familiar sensation of Kevin's healing spells layering onto her. One after another, and the wounds the monster had ripped open began to mend. Still, it would take more than a few minutes for her to completely heal, and the monster wouldn't remain pinned in place for long. That's where the other 2 members of the party came in. Bryce had begun casting the second he'd stepped through the portal, and he would be occupied for a few more seconds still. Meanwhile, Lisa had circled around to the back, unnoticed by the monster. And even as Alyssa gathered herself for another pass at the creature, Lisa struck. Twice. Her swords arched out, biting deep under the influence of her abilities. The Voxian monster screamed in pain, terror, and rage, ripping itself free of Alyssa's spear. Before Lisa could react, it wheeled around, catching her with a backhand that sent her sprawling. Alyssa bounded forward, dragging her trusty machete from the sheath at her hip. As she did, she used Heart of the Dragon and Enrage in conjunction, sending her attributes skyrocketing. Her first attack hit the creature's shoulder, and the blade didn't stop until it was embedded in its collarbone. She tried to yank the weapon free, but it was stuck fast. So, she let it go and kicked out, taking the monster in the stomach. It staggered back but recovered quickly. Still, with Alyssa's attributes so enhanced, it was no match for her. She raced forward, not at the monster, but at the spear she'd left embedded in the rocky ground. When she reached the weapon, she wrapped her fingers around the familiar haft and yanked it free. That was when Heart of the Dragon ran its course. Her attributes plummeted, eliciting a gasp and a stumble at exactly the wrong time. She twisted around, trying to get her spear up, but the Voxian monster was already upon her. It tackled her to the ground, then raised its talons high into the air. They fell. Alyssa screamed as she was torn to pieces. Kevin screamed as he tried to layer his healing spells on her, and for a moment, they did the trick. She healed almost as quickly as the monster could tear through her body. But it was short-lived, obviously the result of some ability that accelerated the healing over time effects upon which he relied so heavily. Then Lisa was back, her swords moving in a blur as she sliced into the creature's back. It wasn't much damage, not really. But it was enough to get its attention. The moment it turned to her, Alyssa kicked away. It paid her no mind, intent as it was on getting to Lisa. For her part, the young scout bounded away, barely faster than the scaled monster. That was the opening Bryce needed. He let loose with his spell, and a huge ball of molten rock descended from the sky. When it hit the Voxian monster, it sent out a shockwave powerful enough to nearly knock the recovering Alyssa from her feet. Lisa stumbled to her knees before pitching forward onto her chest, and the monster was buried under a pile of lava. The spell only lasted a moment before it dissipated, and when it did, a sizable crater, at least 10 feet wide and a few feet deep, was revealed. The monster wasn't dead, though. It pushed itself to unsteady feet, then looked around. Its scales were smoking, and it was clearly wounded. But it was still standing. Alyssa, who was still healing, intended to put an end to that. So, she bounded forward in a loping run. She couldn't use Descending Dragon so soon, but Heroic Leap had no cooldown. She intended to use that to her advantage. Before she did, though, she used Heavy Blows, then Charge. Finally, she kicked off the ground, using Heroic Leap, sending her rocketing through the air. Before she reached the monster, she threw Bulwark out behind it, then used Champion's Shout. The creature froze for a split second, which allowed Alyssa to, once again, stab it in the chest. As she did, she used Impale, which, in the event that it didn't immediately die, would cause damage over time. Her momentum knocked the monster back, but it could only go a few inches before it hit her bulwark, which acted as an anvil. And she was the hammer. Bones cracked on both sides, but Alyssa had the benefit of Kevin's healing. She reared back, yanking her spear free before stabbing it again. Then again after that. 3 times, she managed to wound it before the monster knocked her free. The moment Alyssa was clear, another spell, this time, sharpened spikes of ice ascending from the ground, exploded into the creature. Seeing that it was distracted, both Alyssa and Lisa hit it again. This time, its responses were sluggish, and they managed to do quite a bit more damage than the first few forays. But still, the monster was dangerous and immensely powerful, and they were both forced to retreat a moment later. That's when Bryce shouted, "After this, I'm out." Then, a giant, earthen worm burst forth from the ground, wrapped itself around the monster, and squeezed. It screamed, but its bestial cries fell on deaf ears. Bryce's summon only lasted a few seconds before it fell apart, but by then, the monster was barely standing. Alyssa approached with steady resolve, and when she got in range, she thrust her spear forward with deadly accuracy. The creature tried to respond, but it was far too sluggish. The blade took it in the throat, and Alyssa ripped it free a moment later, leaving a jagged wound behind. That was the last straw, and it tipped forward, falling flat on its face. A few seconds later, it bled out, sending a deluge of experience to blanket the group. The moment the monster died, a pure, white crystal appeared before Alyssa. She reached out, touching it, prompting a notification. "Congratulations! By closing a minor dimensional rift, you have done a great service to your world. Thus, you have earned a reward. Minor attribute potion awarded." Alyssa also gained a level, pushing her to level 14 and granting a new ability. She didn't take the time to inspect it, instead focusing on the vial of white liquid in her hand. She looked around, seeing that all the others were holding similar rewards. "Well, I guess we win," said Bryce, raising his arms in a sarcastic cheer. "Yes." Elijah was in mid-celebration when he felt something about the current change. No stranger to ambushes, he wheeled around, ready to defend himself. But when he did, he saw nothing but a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. Panicked, he tried to dash away, but he only took a single step before the maw closed around him. He let out a gurgling scream as the jaws clamped down on him, but he kept enough of his wits about him to grab hold of whatever he could and drag himself forward. The creature's teeth ripped a ragged wound down his side and very nearly tore his leg off, and yet he still managed to pull himself to safety. With terror and agony tearing through his mind, Elijah barely managed to slap a hand on his side and cast Touch of Nature before the creature's bulbous, purple tongue shifted and forced him down its slimy throat. Crushing pressure encapsulated him, breaking bones and making him feel like an overfilled balloon on the verge of bursting. Somewhere in the back of his mind where the terror, pain, and panic couldn't reach him, Elijah recognized what was happening as the muscles in the creature's throat slowly pushed him down its esophagus. But he could barely think, much less acknowledge that seemingly useless information. Somehow, he managed to recast Touch of Nature. The healing spell wasn't enough to keep up with the crushing damage, but it was barely capable of keeping him alive and conscious. Pain, he would later acknowledge, was not something to which one could really grow accustomed. Elijah learned the truth of that as he was slowly but surely crushed as the creature swallowed him. Without his consistent use of Touch of Nature or the ability to breathe underwater that had been granted by the Ring of Aquatic Travel, he would have perished. The same could be said about his constitution, which had been further enhanced by essence of the boar. Still, Elijah couldn't think straight enough to be grateful. In fact, if death would have closed in on him, he might have been thankful. Yet, held at bay by his healing spell, death did not come, and eventually, Elijah broke free of the esophagus and fell into a pit of acid. Screaming while he recast Touch of Nature, Elijah dragged himself forward, crawling across the fleshy innards of the monster until, at last, the sting of the acid began to dissipate. But just because the acid wasn't eating through him at a visible rate, that didn't mean it wasn't still killing him. Away from the center of what must have been the monster's stomach, the acid had been diluted by the water, but it was still there, slowly dissolving his flesh. Through the pain, Elijah forced himself to focus just enough to take stock of his Ethera. It was dangerously low. And he knew he couldn't keep using Touch of Nature. He'd run out of Ethera, and then he'd die a slow and agonizing death. But with Healing Rain, there was a possibility that he could keep pace with the damage being wrought on his body. So he cast it. Apparently, being underwater wasn't enough to stop the spell from activating, and as the falling rain, Elijah didn't question how that was possible, he felt the healing magic begin to take hold. But just because he was constantly regenerating didn't mean that the pain had stopped. Indeed, it only meant that, so long as he could keep Healing Rain active, the damage was negated by the regeneration. Still, the cycle of damage and regeneration still hurt. A lot. And as a result, Elijah started to go into shock. And that shock eventually ushered him into unconsciousness. When he awoke some indeterminate time later, his Healing Rain had run its course, and the acid had gained some ground. So, he recast the spell and tried to force himself to remain conscious long enough to utilize the Ethera that had regenerated while he'd been unconscious. To that end, he cast Touch of Nature, marginally healing the wound in his side. It didn't do much. In fact, the spell didn't even completely close the wound. But it was progress, and in his situation, that was all he could really hope for. From that point on, Elijah's world devolved into a cycle of hellish agony and healing. It was not pleasant. In fact, it was the worst experience of his life. And given that he'd gone through multiple rounds of radiation and chemotherapy, that was saying something. For a long time, he was incapable of rational thought. Instead, he focused the entirety of his consciousness on maintaining the cycle. Regenerate. Heal some more. Cast Healing Rain. Keep healing. Regenerate. Hours must have passed. Perhaps days. Elijah had no means of keeping track. But gradually, he gained ground until, at last, the wound on his side had healed as much as it could when encased in a pool of diluted acid. Then he started on his leg. The monster's teeth had ripped a long, jagged wound that ran from mid-ankle all the way to his knee, exposing muscle, bone, and everything else skin was supposed to hide. Resting his hand on the injury, he began the cycle anew. By the time he finished, weeks had to have passed, but it might as well have been an eternity. With the ubiquitous pain keeping him from resting, his mind had descended well past the dividing line between sanity and madness. The only thing that had kept him from plunging headlong into insanity was the focus he'd had to maintain. Otherwise, he would have long since succumbed. But it still took its toll, and as he finally saw the wound in his leg heal, the only thought on his mind was vengeance against the monster who was responsible for shoving him into a pit of hell. And without the need to use all of his Ethera on healing, he had options available. The first thing he tried was Swarm, but his conjured piranha only lasted a quarter of their usual time before the acid did them in. That was fine. He had other spells. After renewing Healing Rain, Elijah cast Shape of the Predator. He still couldn't swim, but what he had in mind only required him to stand still and attack. He could do that. And so he did, ripping into the monster's innards with his claws. But it wasn't enough. The creature was tough, and even though he spent the entirety of Healing Rain's duration furiously digging into the thing's flesh, the only effect was a shallow divot. Transforming back into his human form, Elijah renewed Healing Rain and forced himself to think. With the pain of his skin being constantly dissolved by the acid and rebuilt by Healing Rain, his thoughts were sluggish. Still, he could think just clearly enough to recognize that he was missing something incredibly important. Though, try as he might, he couldn't put his finger on it. Then, like a lightning bolt, it hit him. Venom Strike. The ability he'd yet to use because he had no interest in getting close to monsters when he was in his human form. But now, he was already close. Too close, really. To focus his mind, he pulled up the ability's description. The ability, Venom Strike, imbues an attack with fast-acting neurotoxin. Usable in all forms. Damage doubled when in predator form. Double damage when in predator form. That was all Elijah needed to set his path. Still, he couldn't immediately take the first step down that road. Instead, he had to wait until he'd regenerated enough Ethera to fuel the transformation into his predator form. Then, he needed to cast the spell directly after renewing Healing Rain. Otherwise, he would lose ground to the acid still steadily eating away at his skin. So, he waited. In agony. Compared to the time he'd already spent in the creature's stomach, it was nothing. but with the plan for his eventual escape taunting him, Elijah could barely stand it. It felt like an eternity. Still, in the back of his mind, buried beneath a mountain of pain, he knew that if he jumped the gun, he would only make things worse. With that firmly entrenched in his mind, he continued to wait and suffer. Eventually, though, Elijah recovered enough Ethera to power his transformation into a mist panther. Still, he waited until he could renew healing rain before he initiated the spell. As usual, the transformation didn't take long, and as soon as it was complete, he used Venom Strike. Then he attacked. The effect was immediate, and the monster's response nearly threw Elijah from his feet. He clung to the fleshy stomach lining with his claws and attacked once again. And again after that. He kept digging into the monster's innards, with each swipe of his claws bearing with it a refreshed Venom Strike. Each attack drained a bit of his stamina, and within 30 seconds, he could barely hold himself upright. So, he switched back to his human form to wait for the neurotoxin to take hold. The moment he did, though, he realized his mistake. In the ubiquitous pain clouding his mind, Elijah hadn't considered the fact that, as a human, he didn't have any claws, and so, the moment he switched back, the monster's convulsions sent him flying back into the dense acid in the center of the stomach. If he'd been in agony before, there was no word capable of describing what he felt as he plunged into the more concentrated acid. He flailed, watching his skin melting away with every passing moment. Then, the most powerful shudder yet rocked the stomach, and suddenly, Elijah was flying forward. He hit the esophagus, and it opened. A second later, a powerful current pushed him into the fleshy hose until, at last, he passed the teeth that had ripped him to pieces. And just like that, he was free. Tumbling down through the water, he hit a stand of coral that scraped much of his melted skin from his shoulder, then settled into the silt where he lay, completely incapable of moving. Even as unconsciousness started to close in, Elijah managed to cast healing rain. Then, darkness enveloped him. It only lasted a few moments, and when he awoke, the blessed lack of acid was enough to jolt him back to reality. He still hurt, but it was the pain of more mundane injuries, rather than constant agony of being dissolved. Opening his eyes, Elijah tried to sit up, but immediately wished he hadn't. More agony lanced through his body as he collapsed onto the ground. Checking his Ethera, he saw that he had enough to fuel a few casts of Touch of Nature. Maybe he'd been out longer than he thought. So, he flopped his arm over his stomach and cast the spell. A wave of healing magic swept through him, making him feel slightly better, but it was directionless and only resulted in a slightly better overall condition. Still, it was better than nothing, especially when combined with the ongoing regeneration from the still-active healing rain. And after his time being slowly digested within the monster's stomach, the small relief the spell brought with it was more than welcome. He cast the spell 3 more times before his Ethera ran dry. Then, he lay back and waited for his core to regenerate. As he did so, he focused on the funnel of his mind, trying to force more and more ambient Ethera into his soul. It was mildly successful, though the improvement over his normal meditative regeneration was barely noticeable. It might have even been his imagination at work. Whatever the case, he resolved to keep it up on the off chance that he wasn't imagining things. Gradually, his core refilled until, at last, he could continue his efforts to heal his ravaged body. One cast of Touch of Nature after another, and after using 2 cores worth of Ethera, he felt well enough to sit up. His body protested as he levered himself upright and looked down at his arm. It was a withered mass of flesh that looked like nothing so much as a melted candle. Groaning, Elijah grabbed it and resumed his healing. With each cast of Touch of Nature, his arm looked a little better. More, he slowly regained feeling as the nerves and muscles rebuilt themselves. However, when he finally finished the healing process, his arms still bore significant scarring. Fortunately, the rest of his body had escaped that fate, though his clothing and hair had long since dissolved. His staff had survived, though, and once he picked himself up, he found it only a few feet away. So, naked as the day he was born, and even more hairless, Elijah started toward the creature that had fallen only a few dozen yards away. The neurotoxin of Venom Strike had nearly killed the monster that had tried to eat him, but the job still wasn't finished. With vengeance in his heart, Elijah aimed to change that. Elijah rolled his shoulders as he strode forward, but in the back of his mind, he realized that the effect was probably ruined by the curious, bouncing gait required to walk across the seafloor. He didn't care, though. Instead, he only had eyes for the monster that had tried to eat him. It was an orca. Or that was the closest analog Elijah could conjure. The thing was at least 100 feet long, with the same sturdy, yet sleek black and white body as the familiar marine mammals. But like all the other animals he'd seen in the sea and on the island, come to that, everything about it seemed more exaggerated. From its huge, jagged teeth to its slightly more angular body, it was like a cartoon version of the creatures with which he was familiar. And it was obviously dying. The thing was still breathing, but it couldn't move more than a few feet in any direction. So, as Elijah approached, it only succeeded in flopping around a bit. Still, it was a monster that probably weighed dozens of tons, so there was a very real danger of being crushed. With that in mind, Elijah took great care as he drew closer. But it didn't even acknowledge his presence. Instead, it seemed wholly focused on its own agony as Elijah's repeated usage of venom strikes slowly ate away at it. Given the orca's massive size, Elijah knew its death would not be quick. Instead, it was in for a slow and agonizing process. There was a part of him that thought it served the creature right. After spending what felt like an eternity being digested by the sea mammal, Elijah thought it had gotten its just desserts. However, the marine biologist inside of him rejected that idea. As much as he wanted to take pleasure in its suffering, Elijah couldn't shed the lessons he'd learned at his father's knee. Killing wasn't wrong. Instead, death and predation were necessary parts of nature. Elijah had never shied away from hunting or fishing, but his father had taught him that any responsible hunter tried to minimize his prey's suffering. So, as much as Elijah wanted to anthropomorphize the enormous killer whale and assign blame, the reality was that the thing had merely been acting according to its nature. There was no sapience there. It was just an animal, and so, it couldn't be blamed for its actions. So, taking vengeance on the creature was an exercise in futility. It would never understand its mistake. There was no lesson to be taught. No reform to be found. And even though Elijah knew he'd feel a certain satisfaction when the thing was dead, he also knew himself well enough to recognize the fact that, with the benefit of time and distance, he would regret it if he let the thing suffer more than necessary. So, it was with mercy on his mind that Elijah raised his staff and conjured his swarm of piranha, which wasted no time before tearing into the monster. It wasn't enough to finish it off. Nor was the second cast. Or the third. Soon, it became clear that, if he wanted to hasten the monster's death, he would have to do so up close. That was why he found himself leaping from a hastily climbed stalk of coral onto the orca's back. It didn't react. Instead, the creature only continued its weak convulsions as Elijah climbed towards its head, and then, when he reached his destination, transformed into a mist panther. Immediately, he felt awkward, and his instincts screamed at him to somehow get out of the water. He pushed through that and embraced guise of the unseen. Before the fact that he was out in the open and standing atop a giant killer whale could degrade his stealth, Elijah reached back with his claw and used Predator Strike to gouge a massive hole in the orca's head. That woke it up, and its bucking sent Elijah spinning through the water before he landed in a cloud of silt. With the panic of his feline instincts threatening to overwhelm him, Elijah transformed back into his human form. Then, after he healed the minor damage he'd sustained, just a few bruises, he waited for his Ethera to regenerate enough that he could repeat the process. When his core was saturated with Ethera, he climbed the coral stalk, leaped onto the orca's back, and repeated his previous strike. This one went a good deal deeper, but the result was much the same, and he ended up back on the seafloor. It took 3 more uses of Predator Strike before Elijah broke through the monster's thick skull. After that, it only took 1 more attack to destroy its brain. And just like that, a wave of kill energy swept through him, giving him another level and a new ability. More importantly, he also received an update to his task, congratulating him on killing the Guardian. Now, he just needed to reach the center of the Sea of Sorrows in order to complete the 2nd level of the College Tower. Elijah's shoulders sagged, and he took a moment to dig a bit of the monster's brain out. One look at the black tendrils that had infested the creature's flesh, and he knew he couldn't eat any of it. Which was a shame, considering that he had no idea how long it had been since he'd eaten anything. Perhaps his body was more magical than he'd originally thought. Or maybe his constant usage of his healing spells had helped keep him on his feet even as he starved. It was even possible that his perception of time had been skewed by the persistent agony he'd endured. He had no idea, but regardless of how he'd managed to live through his ordeal, he was now starving. So, without hesitation, Elijah slid off the monster's back and immediately set off through the Sea of Sorrows. Eventually, he stumbled across a school of mid-sized fish that he killed with a trio of Storm's Fury casts. Then, like the starving man he was, he tore into them with reckless abandon. Elijah had never been a huge fan of raw fish, but in that moment, he considered it the best meal he'd ever had. He gorged himself, then gathered a few of the fish he hadn't already eaten before moving on. Like that, he kept going for the next few hours until he finally found a shallow cave in which he could rest. Once he'd blocked the entrance, Elijah settled in to inspect the ability he'd received upon reaching level 26. It was a spell. Aura of Renewal. Tap into the power of nature to increase your regeneration by 10 points. Usable on allies. Elijah let out a chuckle that came out in a gurgle and sent a stream of bubbles drifting toward the ceiling of the small cave. That certainly would have come in handy while he was being digested. He just stared at the spell and shook his head before mentally canceling one of his other augmentations, Essence of the Monkey, and replacing it with his new spell. Essence of the Monkey was great for when he was on land, but in the Sea of Sorrows, both Aura of Renewal and Essence of the Boar seemed much more important. Those two took up his only available enhancement slots, leaving Essence of the Monkey as the odd one out. Hopefully, though, he would get another slot sometime soon. At least Essence of the Wolf seemed to be a different category, perhaps because its effect was restricted to out of combat, so he didn't have to make the choice between more constitution or faster movement speed. In any case, Aura of Renewal was a nice addition. Still, he couldn't help but wonder what the future might hold. Perhaps he would get an augmentation that would enhance his Ethera next so he could complete the set. As he thought about his attributes, he couldn't help but toggle open his status. Elijah Hart, level 26. Archetype, Druid, class, Animist, Specialization, not applicable. Alignment, not applicable. Strength, 28. Dexterity, 27. Constitution, 33, 28. 36. Regeneration, 40. Movement, Nature, Cultivation, Body, Formed, Neophyte. As always, his attributes had gone up by a single point for each of his 2 levels. It wasn't enough that he could notice the difference from before he'd killed the orca, but looking back to when he'd first entered the College Tower, Elijah certainly felt stronger, more durable, and more coordinated. And he could cast his spells more often, which spoke to the size of his core. Finally, he felt certain that, without those few points he'd gained in regeneration, he never would have survived the killer whale's stomach acids. So, while he hadn't made huge strides, they were enough to make the difference between life and death. Which was all Elijah could really ask for, all told. Aside from maybe asking not to spend weeks being digested by a giant orca. That would have been nice too, but maybe that would have been expecting a little too much, given the world in which he now lived. Such thoughts occupied Elijah's mind as he settled into rest and recover as much as he could. He slept, albeit fitfully, and soon enough, the urge to continue to the next and final level of the tower grew overwhelming. So, after once again gorging himself on the leftover fish, he used Touch of Nature to remove any chance of food poisoning, then set off. The next day stretched his capabilities. Not by pitting him against powerful monsters. By that point, he'd spent long enough in the Sea of Sorrows that he felt almost as comfortable in that submerged environment as he did on his own island. Rather, the problem was his own body, which, despite his increased attributes, had been ravaged by malnourishment as well as the acid that had slowly eaten away at him. In fact, when he looked down at his thin limbs and exposed ribs, he suspected that he weighed less than he had at any time since the plane crash that had stranded him on the island. And that was more than a little distressing because at that time, he'd been fresh off his 3rd round of chemotherapy. Curiously, the problem didn't present itself in a way he might have expected. He was just as strong as ever before, but he could only show that strength in extremely short bursts before he grew exhausted. The same could be said for his ability to traverse the Sea of Sorrows. He could only go for an hour or two before he needed to rest, which was a far cry from what he'd experienced before his bout of whale digestion. But gradually, as he continued to eat his weight in slain monsters, from fish to turtles and everything in between, his endurance returned. By the end of that first week after his encounter with the killer whale, he'd reached what he thought of as the halfway point in his quest to recover his stamina. A week after that, he finally felt fully recovered, a feeling that was supported by his increased weight. It was just in time, too, because that was when he finally reached the center of the Sea of Sorrows, which presented itself as a huge hole in the seabed that stretched hundreds of yards across. It didn't take a genius to guess that, in order to reach the third level, he would have to take the plunge and dive into the hole. Still, he couldn't help but hesitate, especially when he found himself at the edge of the hole and looking down into the shadowy abyss. Could he have been wrong about it being his goal? Of course. But given the saturation of Ethera in the area, he didn't think so. He'd also circled the pit, searching for anything else that might qualify as his destination. But he'd found nothing but more coral and kelp. No, it was the right place, but knowing that did nothing to assuage the fear coursing through Elijah's veins. The first level had been fairly easy. The second had stretched him to his limits. And it stood to reason that the difficulty would only increase going ahead. But as he kept reminding himself, there was no choice in the matter. He couldn't go back. Even the teleport associated with Ancestral Circle was disabled within the tower, which he'd confirmed at some point during the cycle of healing and dissolution he'd experienced in the whale's stomach. The only way out was through. So, he squared his shoulders, then dove into the abyss.